Chapter 236. The battlefield under the tree had quieted down. The brocade guard had used carriages to transport a lot of water from the Wuxia River. With a tilt of the bucket, the clear water splashed onto the street. In a flash, the dust and blood on the ground were washed away, leaving only the wet, clean stone slabs. There were brocade guards keeping watch all around, and there were also related yamens conducting surveillance in the various houses, so there were no unusual movements around the T-shaped alley. The stone wall at the back of the courtyard was also beginning to be temporarily sealed up. In short, the Discipline Commission had to restore this area to its original state as quickly as possible. The palace did not want to bring up this matter at this time. After all, Tan Wu and the others had died a heroic death. It would be difficult to frame Shang Shanhu, and after all, they had to consider the military's attitude, so they were prepared to keep it under wraps for a while. The morning birds chirped. The brocade guards raised their heads and looked at the sky, which had not yet brightened. They thought to themselves that the birds had woken up early. Did they know what had happened here? Hiding under the tree, Fan Xian wiped away a drop of cold sweat from his forehead. He cursed the sleepless birds in his heart. He carefully hid his figure in the darkness before dawn, following the wounded brocade guards from a distance as they made their way north of the city. There were no pedestrians on the long street, and there was no rustling of street sweepers from his previous life. He leaped across the two-story buildings on the neighboring street, confident that no one would discover his tracks. The stretcher-bearers were already far away from the small courtyard and had entered another, but he didn't know if it was the Discipline Commission or the 13 yamens. The wounded were separated into different rooms, waiting for treatment. A few bloodied doctors hurried in and out. Fan Xian circled around to the back and waited behind a few bamboo baskets in the corner. Not long after, a few muffled grunts came from a side room. The sound was very soft, but it clearly reached his ears. After a few breaths, a person climbed down from the wall. His movements were slow, and after landing on the ground, he carefully tidied up his clothes and confirmed his identity token. Only then did he step forward and walk toward West Street. Fan Xian saw that the person was wearing the uniform of the brocade guards. Although the man wore his hat tightly, a few strands of white hair still flew out. As he slowly walked, the white hair trembled slightly, looking extremely miserable in the night wind. Watching the man walk further and further away, Fan Xian's eyes, which were not covered by his hat, shone with a cold light. He noticed that the way the man walked was a little strange, and knew that his old comrade's legs had not healed after he had broken them. He followed, and the two of them walked along the quiet street to the west. Although there were guards at every intersection, Shaoan was dressed in the uniform of the brocade guard, and he had killed people in the side rooms to steal their tokens. This allowed him to pass through several checkpoints without any mishaps. Fan Xian was like a ghost disappearing into the night. Following from a distance, he easily passed through a few trials. On the way, Shaoan took a break at an ordinary person's house. Behind them, on the roof of an ordinary house, Fan Xian also rested for a while. Then, the two of them stood up one after the other. Before the sky brightened, they crawled out of the net the embroidered uniform guards had woven and arrived at the western city gate. After the city gate was opened, the vegetable farmers who had been waiting outside for almost an hour each handed over the travel documents that had been prepared by the officials in the city and rushed in. And Shaoan also took advantage of this chaos to sneak out of the high city gate. After a while, the old man who had survived a calamity had already made his way with difficulty to the foot of Mount Yen, west of Shangjing, next to the disorderly forest. Fan Xian followed from afar, his extremely sharp eyes staring in the direction of the old comrade's advance. After a while, Shaoan emerged from the forest. He was dressed in tattered clothes, and the corners of his clothes were stained with the black soot of an old man in the village. He had gathered so much firewood from who knew where, and carried it on his back like a small mountain. The sun had already risen from the east, illuminating the quiet mountain forest. In a flash, it dispersed the mist and the air was clear. Anyone who saw that old man would think of him as a hard-working old farmer who had risen in the morning to gather firewood. No one would associate him with the famous spy chief of 20 years ago. Fan Xian stood quietly in the tree, coldly watching Shaoan's hunched body as he slowly advanced. A chill welled up in his heart. After all, Shaoan was old. Not only was his body not as good as it had been, but even his mind was a bit slow. Who would choose to come out to gather firewood at this time of the day? The real farmers would only enter the mountains at dusk to collect firewood. It was quiet outside the city, and it was also quiet inside the city. The spy of the embroidered uniform guard reported, "The Qing diplomatic mission is very quiet. It is said that Master Lin went arranged for 2 singers to accompany Envoy Fan yesterday. They didn't sleep much last night. Are you sure Fan Xian is in the diplomatic mission? Xin Zhong had already taken off his official robes and changed into his rich man's clothes. He held a piece of roasted donkey meat in his right hand and brought it to his mouth. Yes, sir, the spy replied respectfully. Some of our brothers know what Fan Xian looks like, and they have been watching from outside the courtyard. Xin Zhong was slightly taken aback. He tossed the greasy donkey meat onto the table. His eyes were slightly sunken, and he appeared particularly listless. After a night of torment, no one's body was made of iron. Suddenly he laughed and said, "How could that be an honest person? Has Friar he already left?" Yes. The spy suddenly became spirited. Master Lang Qiao has also gone. Xin Zhong slowly closed his eyes. No one knew what he was thinking. After a while he quietly said to himself, "These southern barbarians want us to think that Fan Xian is still in the diplomatic mission. If we kill Fan Xian now, won't they suffer a loss?" He opened his eyes, which were as ruthless as an eagle's. These southern barbarians have learned to scheme over the past decade. I'm afraid their cleverness will make them fall victim to it. After a night of watching, Fan Xian also felt a little tired. But the tyrannical Jinqi in his body was incomparably abundant, so he could still manage. Looking at the old man on the forest path in the distance, who had difficulty even walking, he couldn't help but feel some admiration. He was already 70 or 80 years old, and after decades of torment, he had actually managed to escape from prison so thoroughly. Fan Xian didn't know where this old man got his mental strength from. Fan Xian didn't move because he always felt that some unknown danger was waiting for him. And Xiaowen's exit from the city seemed a little too smooth. Suddenly he thought of a certain possibility. He narrowed his eyes, slid down the tree and retreated in the opposite direction. In a flash he disappeared to who knew where. The sun moved westward inch by inch, and Xiaowen moved westward inch by inch. To the west was the western sky. It could be death or it could be pure land. Naturally, the diplomatic mission and Xinjiang wouldn't report all their plans to Shang Shanhu, and Xiaowen also had other plans. The mountain path went up and up until it came to an end. On the edge of a cliff was a hill overgrown with shallow grass. To the left was a stone road that led to the Shangjing army's horse camp. This was where Shang Shanhu and Xiaowen had agreed to meet up. The faint red light in Xiaowen's eyes had already dimmed. He tilted his shoulders slightly, letting the small mountain of wet firewood fall to the ground. He patted his butt and sat down. Since there was no one to meet up with him, this plan must have been discovered by the Qi Kingdom's palace. Needless to say, someone must be waiting for him here. Just like that time on the meadow by Wudu, Xiaowen once again felt tired. He didn't want to go any further. "Come out." His slightly dry lips opened and closed and he spat out a few words. As soon as he spoke, the grass trembled. A black-robed swordsman slowly walked out from the end of the mountain path. This swordsman had a very high forehead, and his face was very pale. His brows and eyes seemed to have weathered the vicissitudes of life. He was about 40 years old, and his right hand rested firmly on the hilt of his sword. His knuckles protruded from between his fingers. His entire person was like a cold sword. Friar he? Xiaowen's eyes narrowed and a cold light shone from them. This swordsman was Friar He, one of the few 9th-level aces in northern Qi. The 8th-level Qing Jushu that Fan Xian had killed a year and a half ago on the street of Niulan was his disciple. Friar He's face was pale, and his black robes contrasted with each other like charcoal. He gripped the hilt of his sword with utmost respect, raised it upside down and cupped his fists in salute. "Greetings, Mr. Xiao." In northern Qi except for Ku He, everyone else could only greet Xiaowen with the respect of a junior. Who would have thought that the young swordsman of yesteryear would now become the most powerful swordsman of the Brocade Guard? Xiaowen coughed, still sitting on the ground, and gently massaged his knees. "It's been many years." Friar He looked at Xiaowen, his face full of sincere respect. "I am not a dog of the Brocade Guard. I am a follower of the Empress Dowager. Today I have come to ask Mr. Xiao to rest in peace." Xiaowen said softly, "You must know that this world belongs to His Majesty." Friar He knew what this old man meant. The emperor did not want to kill Xiaowen, and by standing on the side of the Empress Dowager, he would undoubtedly offend the young emperor. He smiled and looked around. "I had thought that I would see that young talent of the Fan dynasty today." Xiaowen coughed again. "Who would have thought that after running amok for so long, I would die as bait? Old sir, there is no need to grieve. Since that Fan Xian has retreated, he is lucky. With a swish, Friar he unsheathed his sword and flew forward like a bird. His wrist, elbow and shoulder formed a straight line as he stabbed towards Xiaoen's heart. Chapter 237. The tip of the sword plunged into Xiaoen's left shoulder, and he pulled it out in a split second, drawing out a spray of blood. However, the flower was not particularly beautiful. Xiaoen's old body seemed to have much less blood in it than a young man's. With a dull thud, Friar he held his sword across his chest and retreated. Xiaoen sat on the ground, holding a branch as thick as a forearm in his withered right hand. When Friar he thrust his sword earlier, the old man had used some unknown technique to disregard his left shoulder and strike Friar he's shin with the branch from an impossible angle. The tip of the branch in his hand had been smashed to smithereens, a testament to the strength of the blow. Friar he felt a sharp pain in his left leg, and his already pale face turned even whiter. His right hand still held the hilt of his sword steadily, but his left leg, which had been struck by the tree branch, began to tremble. He had thought that, with his 9th level strength, it would be easy for him to kill a weary old man covered in old wounds. Even though he knew that his opponent was Xiaoen, the terrifying Xiaoen he had known all those years ago, he had made ample preparations. But he still did not expect the old man to be so unpredictable and strange. Xiaoen coughed and said, "My leg was broken by that fan kit, so I had to hit your leg first. Even if I couldn't break it." Before Xiaoen could finish speaking, Friar he swung his sword again. His sword was like a swimming dragon, circling around Xiaoen, who was trapped on the ground. He had long since let go of any thoughts of underestimating his opponent. Instead, he carefully dealt with him as if he were facing a grandmaster. Friar he's swordsmanship was completely different from the common schools of thought in the world. It was said that he had inherited it from a certain barbarian in the north of the mountains, and was as fierce as a swimming dragon. Occasionally it would be diluted, but it was in harmony with the natural principles of Ku He's lineage. It was said that after he had completed his swordsmanship, he had once asked Ku He for advice and had benefited greatly. At this time Xiaoen only had a wooden stick in his hand. It was difficult for him to move and he was trapped. Even so, the branch in Xiaoen's hand was like the tongue of a viper, flicking and flicking around his body. Occasionally, it would stab out horizontally with a strange edge, forcing Friar he to retreat. But Friar he's true chi gradually rose, and sword light enveloped his body. The air began to buzz and Xiaoen's wooden stick was no match for him. The sword and the staff clashed, and the branch in Shan's hand immediately became countless pieces of wood floating in the air. Xiaoen stretched out his hand and casually picked up a branch. He thrust it diagonally to the right, breaking Friar he's soul-chasing sword. He came from the mountains with a bundle of firewood, but the wet twigs would run out sooner or later. After an unknown period of time, the heat of the summer gradually rose at the end of the mountain road, and the sun began to spread its sinister rays. Xiaoen's tattered clothes were riddled with narrow gashes, from which blood was seeping out. There were a few deep wounds on his chest and one could even see the flesh torn by the sword aura. However, the old man had lost too much blood, so the wounds were pale. Around his body, there was a layer of densely packed mosquito wings and limbs. These insects that did not know life or death had smelled the blood, but in a moment, they were sucked into the sword chi true power and turned into dust. 5 steps in front of Xiaoen, Friar he stood, sword in hand. His pale face was tinged with blood, and his right hand, which held the hilt of his sword, finally showed signs of trembling. He hadn't had it easy either. His black shirt had long since been chopped into a mess by the wet twigs around Xiaoen. His body was covered in wounds and even more frightening were the fresh twigs and stubble around them. "Come out. That fan kid won't come." Friar he swallowed. He hadn't expected the old man's desire to live to be so strong. But seeing that Xiaoen was about to die, and that the expected southern chi man still hadn't made a move, he couldn't help but call out to his companions. Xiaoen's eyelids fluttered, and he glanced at the enemy who had been hiding nearby. "Ku," he called out to these juniors. "Isn't that a little disrespectful?" The man approached in silence, holding a curved knife in each hand. What was particularly frightening about the blades were the many thin steel spikes that looked like the wounds on Friar he's body. He silently bowed to Xiaoen. Sister Haitang escorted Mr. Xiao back to the capital. Because of His Majesty's strict orders, we could not attack. Today Mr. Xiao escaped from prison and I had no choice but to act. Please forgive me, Mr. Xiaoen laughed coldly. Ku He's disciples have indeed learned his way of scaring people. On the surface they appear to be benevolent and righteous, but secretly they are evil and treacherous. They're just looking for an excuse to kill me. Why make it sound so innocent? This man was Ku He's first disciple, the emperor's martial arts teacher, Lang Tiao. Seeing that Xiao En was insulting his teacher, he didn't say anything more. He crossed his wrists, and the two curved knives in his hands became two balls of black light, flying toward Xiao En's head. Xiao En suddenly let out a wild roar. The pure inner strength he had cultivated for nearly 50 years finally exploded. He pushed out his palms, attacking Lang Tiao's knives from an impossible angle. The wind from his palms was swift and fierce. If Xiao En's palms killed him, Lang Tiao's wrists would immediately be shattered. Lang Tiao was silent, but he twisted his wrists, and the two sharp curved knives in his hands spun back in a strange way. The backs of the knives struck the back of Xiao En's hands. Two sounds rang out at the same time. The back of Xiao En's hands was instantly sliced by the steel spikes on the two curved knives, but at the same time Xiao En's palms had also reached in. Lang Tiao was still expressionless. He let go of the hilts of his knives and pushed out with both palms. After a light sound, the two palms, who were 30 years apart in age, fiercely struck each other. There was nothing fancy about this. It was purely a contest of strength. As Ku He's first disciple, Lang Tiao's spirit was at its peak. Xiao En, on the other hand, had been imprisoned for many years and had suffered all sorts of suffering. He was no longer as brave as he had been in the past. In comparison, Lang Tiao had the upper hand. With a swish, Lang Tiao pushed Xiao En back. With a flick of his wrist, the knives glowed even brighter, slashing toward Xiao En's shoulders. The two curved knives in his hands had a thin chain tied to his wrists. The two knives glowed as they flew toward Xiao En, reflecting the red sun high up in the sky. It was a terrifying sight. The dying Xiao En suddenly found strength from somewhere. His eyes rolled up and his middle finger bent slightly. He raised it toward the sky, blocking the lower edges of Lang Tiao's powerless hands. At this moment, countless gusts of wind rose up. A figure, like a gray dragon, soared into the sky from the grass, directly attacking the two combatants. Friar He had been standing with his sword, waiting for this moment. He had been waiting for Fan Xian to come out. He gripped his sword with both hands. He had been accumulating power for a long time. From head to toe he chopped down vertically without any extra tricks. There was a hissing sound. Even the air seemed to be cut open by the sword, let alone the person who was charging at him at high speed. But Friar He didn't know that the person he wanted to kill was one of the most skilled dodging figures in the world. He only saw the figure twist in the air in a strange manner. Without any leverage, like a shadow, he dodged the attack. As the old saying goes, the more Wu Zhu fights, the harder it is for Fan Xian to get hit. The sword struck empty air. Friar He's chest tightened, and the countless sounds of breaking air arrived in front of him. He valiantly pulled back his sword and made 3 horizontal slashes, knocking down most of the hidden weapons. When the hidden weapons fell to the ground, he realized they were just gravel. He forcefully pulled back his sword. His blood was shaken and he couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. He forcefully swallowed it. As his body froze, 3 beams of black light shot down from the top of his head. The 2 of them were too close. Friar He turned his wrist, and the tip of his sword accurately knocked away the 3 beams of black light. But the last strike was not strong enough, and his Jinshi paused. Although the crossbow bolt had received some force, its direction did not change too much. It brushed past his thigh and stabbed into the grass. That was close. Friar He finally realized how difficult it was to deal with Fan Xian. He turned his head in shock. Fan Xian had forcefully turned around in the air, avoiding Friar He's long-awaited strike. He had paid a heavy price for it. Even though his meridians were much wider than the average martial cultivator's, he still couldn't stop his blood rushing. His Jinshi felt like it was being torn apart, colliding with his meridians. He didn't have the dignity of a martial artist. Still in the air, he spat out a mouthful of blood, looking wretched and wretched. But in a flash, his meridians were cleared. At that moment, Lang Tiao's terrifying twin blades had already sunk deep into Xiao En's shoulders. Fan Xian let out a strange cry. Still in the air, he had already pulled out half of the long blade from his back and swung it at the back of Lang Tiao's head. Lang Tiao seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. With a swish, he pulled back his blade. The tip of the curved blade struck Fan Xian's hilt half a foot, the weakest point of the blade. With a clang, the other half of the long knife in Fan Xian's hand broke again, but the pitiful remaining part of the knife still chopped down brutally. Ding 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 ding, it swept away all the steel spikes on the curved knife in Lang Tiao's hand. In that instant, Fan Xian abandoned his blade, circulated his chi and punched out. 2 of his best black fists transformed into 2 dragons, striking at Lang Tiao's temples. He didn't care that the tip of his opponent's blade was aimed at his lower abdomen. He knew that against an expert of this level, he had to be steady, accurate, and ruthless. He had to leave no way out for himself and no way out for his opponent. Lang Qiao suddenly turned his head, a cold light flashing in his eyes. He crossed his palms and sealed Fan Xian's fists. Their energies intersected. The tyrannical Jinqi of the nameless martial secrets and the Tianyi Jinqi of Ku he finally met. Chapter 238. On the short grass on the side of the cliff, there was an earth-shattering sound. Fan Xian's body was in midair and had the advantage of the heavens. Lang Qiao's feet were on the ground and he borrowed the strength of the terrain. The two vast waves of Jinqi collided together. Even the grass around the two of them was crushed to dust. Lang Qiao grunted and swung the scimitar tied to his wrist backwards. With a squelch, it pierced into Xiaoen's chest. Although this was a double trap, if he couldn't kill Fan Xian, he had to kill Xiaoen first. This was something his teacher, Ku He, had always kept an eye on. Fan Xian's palms were scorching hot. Lang Qiao's body turned, and the two scimitars sliced towards Fan Xian's chest like a windmill. The snow-splashing scimitars were coming for his soul. At this moment, Xiaoen was about to die, and Fan Xian could no longer escape. There was no longer any possibility of playing cat and mouse, so he gritted his teeth and did the riskiest thing he had done since his rebirth. Ignoring Lang Qiao's powerful scimitars, he reached out and grabbed Xiaoen by the collar. In the blink of an eye, he bent his knees slightly and raised his left calf. There was a crisp clang. This was clearly not the sound of a scimitar cutting into human flesh. Fan Xian grunted, flipped over Lang Qiao's head, and flicked a finger with his left hand. This was a small trick. Lang Qiao's earlobe hurt slightly and his eyebrows flew up. Fan Xian's calf felt as if it had been struck by lightning. It was incomparably painful, but he used the power of the scimitar to grab hold of Xiaoen. His uninjured right foot touched the ground, and his whole body had already rushed forward, towards the empty area in front of him. He rushed towards the cliff and then jumped down. Lang Qiao's expression was wooden, but he was shocked. Why did his scimitar feel like it had hit steel when it had landed on Fan Xian's leg? He had great confidence in the power of his scimitar. The secret of the round scimitar was enough to cut through metal. Even if his opponent was wearing armor, it would still be cut in half. How could Fan Xian have blocked it? He rushed to the edge of the cliff and looked out. The sun was getting brighter, but it still could not disperse the fog in the deep valley. They saw the old man and the young man fall into the fog and could no longer be seen. It was only after a long time that they heard the thud of a heavy object falling. The sound was very soft, but the cliff was very deep. The two of them could hear it even from the edge of the cliff, so they could imagine the intensity of the collision. He fell to his death, said Friar He. Lang Qiao shook his head. Xiaoen won't die easily. Fan Xian. I think it's even harder. Lang Qiao and Friar He were one of the few ninth-level masters in Shangjing City, and yet they were unable to kill Xiaoen, who was heavily injured, and Fan Xian, who had just entered the ninth level, on the spot. This fact made the two masters shiver in fear. We can't climb this mountain, Friar He said with a frown. Lang Qiao looked down. Yin Mountain stone walls were as sharp as a knife and as smooth as a mirror. Not even the four transcending mortality and saintly grandmasters would be able to climb up, let alone a martial expert. So he nodded, tacitly agreeing with Daoist He's judgment. Inform Shen Zhong to search the foot of the mountain. After finishing their preparations, the two masters looked up at the misty cliffs. They thought of the previous battle and couldn't help but frown, but they were thinking in different directions. Why did Fan Xian risk his life to save Xiaoen? This was Friar He's question. Why did Fan Xian's strength far exceed little sister's assessment? This was Lang Qiao's question. Suddenly Lang Qiao's eyes flashed coldly. With a flick of his wrist, the tip of his knife accurately sliced off a piece of flesh from his earlobe. Friar He had always trusted Ku He's knowledge and ability. He frowned and looked down at his thigh, only to see the skin where the arrow had grazed. Although he wasn't injured, it was still slightly black. That Fan kid is vicious, he said coldly. Have you forgotten? Fan Xian's most famous skill in the Qing kingdom is called petty tricks, Lang Qiao said in a low voice. Although he said this, Lang Qiao was still thinking about the exchange earlier. The tyrannical Jinqi in Fan Xian's fists was truly strange. It was cold and had an invading intent. Its ruthlessness was more powerful than any kind of internal Jinqi in the world. What did one usually encounter when jumping off a cliff? Usually one would encounter a master, a beautiful woman, a peerless secret manual, and limitless wealth. As Fan Xian jumped off the cliff, he thought that he was indeed carrying a master on his back, but if his calculated landing spot was a bit off, then he would have to say goodbye to the beautiful woman at home. As for the limitless wealth his mother had left behind, he naturally wouldn't have the chance to enjoy it. Speaking of that nameless peerless secret manual, he reckoned Uncle Wu Zhu would burn it for him. Although Uncle Wu Zhu's teaching ability was a bit lacking, he was a faithful executor of spoon-feeding education. Fan Xian reckoned that even if he went to the underworld, he wouldn't let him off lightly. Back in the day, Commander Zhu jumping off a cliff was Fan Xian's most amazing scene, so he often practiced jumping off cliffs. Even when he was on his honeymoon in the Tsang Mountains, he didn't let it go. Now he finally had a little success, at least with a person on his back. He was able to accurately use the short pine trees between the smooth rock walls to slow down and find the spot he had chosen in advance, the slightly protruding rock. Fan Xian's legs landed on the rock, and the tyrannical Jinshi in his body reacted, bouncing out. But his left leg had suffered from Lang Qiao's frightening knife, and it was sore and powerless. With a grunt, he half knelt on the ground. At that moment he still didn't forget to sweep a large rock off the cliff. After a while there was the sound of it falling to the ground. Are you stupid? There was a small hole behind the rock. It wasn't deep and Xiao En, covered in wounds, was leaning against it. He looked at Fan Xian mockingly. Let's see how you get up there. Fan Xian shrugged. Of course he wouldn't tell the dying old man his secret. He glanced at the hole and confirmed that it had nothing to do with Zhang, then fed Xiao En a pill. Xiao En didn't hold back. He swallowed the pill and looked at Fan Xian mockingly. If this was 20 years ago, how could Lang Qiao and Friar He, two juniors, be a match for me? But you? You are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council of the Kingdom of Qing, the successor of Qin Pingping and Fei Jie, but you were forced off a cliff by someone else, and now you can only wait to starve to death. Fan Xian didn't get angry. He smiled. When an old man likes to talk about the past, it's probably because he's about to die. Xiao En's expression didn't change. I was going to die anyway. After living for so many years, dying is not a loss. The problem is that you're still young, so I don't understand why you came to save me. He paused. But why did you dare to jump into the clouds? Your adopted son only knows how to fight. He doesn't know how to do these things. Fan Xian took out a thin needle from his hair and stuck it into Xiao En's body to staunch the bleeding. Even the brocade guard was able to find out where you met up, much less me. Of course I was prepared. Xiao En allowed him to use his medical skills. He rolled his eyes. Your needle is poisoned. Fan Xian wasn't amused. You're going to die anyway. You have hundreds of poisons in your body. What's one more? Xiao En coughed. His eyes dimmed. He was about to die, and even his temperament seemed a little strange. Fan Xian looked at the old man's pale face, which had lost too much blood. He suddenly asked, when Xinzhong surrounded the courtyard, you should have known that Shang Shanhu's rescue operation was part of the brocade guard's plan. Why did you continue? Continue what? Continue pretending to be injured and painstakingly run out of the city. You knew that there would be aces waiting for you, and that the people who came to your aid had long since been eliminated. Xiao En looked at him and suddenly let out a shrill laugh. Perhaps I was just following the intentions of those people. They wanted to lure you out so that you could accompany me in death. Fan Xian shrugged. Let's talk about something serious. Xiao En's gaze easily passed over Fan Xian's shoulder, as if he were looking at an obstacle. He cast his gaze into the deep, quiet valley. The sun was getting stronger and stronger, and the clouds in front of the stone wall finally began to disperse. The mountain wall in front of him was like a cracked yellow mirror, with a different kind of beauty. Well, I've been locked up for a long time. So, even if I die, I don't want to die in prison, said Xiao En. Fan Xian followed his gaze and found that the mountain wall opposite him was extremely smooth. Occasionally, there were cracks that spread out in all directions like the lines of lightning. From far away, he could see an incomparably tenacious small tree growing, revealing its pitiful but respectable green color. There are green trees here and there's green water and white fog below. It's a good grave. Fan Xian smiled and began to tidy up his left trouser leg. The Overwatch Council's clothes were made of fire, theft and sharp weapons, but Lang Qiao's knife had shaken a hole in them. He took out the black, slender dagger that Fei Jie had left for him from his boots. Gently stroking the slightly deformed blade, he sighed. Thank you, but I don't want to change my name to Fan Pingping. Why did you act so stupidly and throw yourself into a dead end? Xiao En looked curiously at Fan Xian's disguised face. An ominous bloody froth seeped from the corners of his dry lips. Perhaps when a person was on the brink of death, their curiosity only grew stronger. Fan Xian placed the dagger by his feet and began to massage the meridians in his frozen calf. Calmly he said, "When I discovered that this was an ambush by Northern Qi, I was indeed prepared to retreat. But seeing that you were about to die, I don't know why my brain suddenly broke, but I jumped out." In truth, the reason was simple. Fan Xian wanted to know Shaoen's secret. He wanted to know where the temple was. He wanted to know the relationship between the temple and Yi Qingmei, and his own rebirth into this world. Between his own life and death, his past, and the ins and outs of his arrogant mother, Fan Xian, who had always cherished his life, could finally afford to be extravagant for once. Chapter 239. The sunlight in the valley seemed to have become tangible. Wherever it shone, the clouds rippled like blue waves disturbed by an oar. Most of the fog had dispersed, but there was still a wisp of smoke lingering in front of the precipice, passing through the scattered green trees. The top of the small cave protruded slightly, and the opposite cliff was very far away from the bottom of the valley. Even with Fan Xian's hearing, it would take him a long time before he could faintly hear the sounds coming from the bottom of the valley. Presumably, the brocade guards of Shangjing were searching for their bodies at the bottom of the valley. The bottom of the valley should be damp and gloomy. Fan Xian reckoned that after a while, they would know that Xiao En and Fan Xian had not fallen off the mountain. Fan Xian guessed that the Northern Qi people would probably think that he and Xiao En were lucky and search along the bottom of the valley. But he did not dare to underestimate Xinzhong's ruthlessness. No one knew when they would turn their attention back to the mirror-like surface of the cliff. As for Lang Qiao, Fan Xian knew from their first encounter that this senior disciple of Haitang was indeed one of the most powerful men in the world. His mind was firm and determined, and he was not the kind of person who would be easily deceived. The mountain breeze stirred and Xiaoen's pale face trembled slightly. The old man had already fallen into a semi-conscious state, and could die at any moment. The sun outside seemed unable to transmit any warmth to this old man who had forced his way to the mountains to meet his death. Fan Xian scratched his head and looked at Xiaoen's face. The old comrade's face was like a layer of orange peel that had been dipped in white pulp. He thought for a moment, then carefully took out the small blue pill from his belt. The pill gave off the faint smell of ephedra leaves, and had already been cut in half with a knife. Fan Xian crushed the remaining half and stuffed it into Xiaoen's mouth. Then he took out a water pipe from his sleeve and dripped water from a water bag hidden in his clothes onto Xiaoen's withered lips. After a while the dying Xiaoen woke up. He opened his eyes, and the scarlet color that had faded reappeared in his pupils. The old man seemed to have regained some of his former power in the moment before his death. "What medicine did you feed me?" "A small blue pill." Fan Xian smiled and said, "It's to raise your spirits. However, it can't help you recover your former glory." Xiaoen naturally did not understand this joke. "You ate before you made your move, right?" Xiaoen's breathing became much more powerful, and his spirit gradually shook off the depression. If it wasn't the final radiance of the setting sun before death, then it meant that the drug had stimulated the remaining energy in the old man's body. Fan Xian did not immediately respond to his question. He stretched out his finger and felt Xiaoen's pulse. He found that it was gradually becoming stronger, but there was a slight dryness to it. He knew that the ephedra pill was beginning to take effect. But this primitive stimulant could raise Xiaoen's spirits for a moment, but it could not save his life. He took a deep breath, looked at Xiaoen calmly and said, "Lang Qiao and Friar He, I broke your leg. Even if we join forces we won't be a match for them, so I have to take some medicine. However, I'm a little curious as to why there are only 2 experts and not a large group of people waiting for us." Xiaoen coughed violently. The medicine was taking effect. He waved his hand with some difficulty. "They don't want to make a big deal out of this. If they can't hide it from the little emperor, there will be trouble in the future." Fan Xian looked at him and thought of the little emperor's reason for sparing his old life. It was the same reason as his own, but he did not continue on this topic. "You saved this old man for no other reason than the secret in this old man's heart." Xiaoen looked at the chirping birds in the valley, and a look of envy flashed in his eyes. "In the end, what is that secret?" "The little emperor wants the temple's help to unite the world." "Why do you want to go to the temple so badly?" "Of course I have my own reasons." "Can you tell me about them?" The 2 spies, one old and one young, were at different stages of history. At this moment, they were calmly chatting like children at the entrance of a village. "Tell me a part of it." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. He felt a little weak. The effects of the ephedra pill were about to fade, and his spirit was a little weary. I don't know if you believe it or not, but I live in this world. Most of the time I am like a tourist. I want to go to all the interesting corners of this world, and the temple is without a doubt the place that interests me the most. Tourist? Xiaowen used a pair of blood-red eyes to stare at Fan Xian's ordinary face in disguise. Fan Xian laughed. Is it strange? Heaven and earth are the travelers of all living things. Time is the traveler of 100 generations. Since you and I live in this great inn, we naturally want to see what is in every room of the inn. Perhaps there is a poisonous snake in the room at the end of the second floor. Xiaowen moved back a little with difficulty. He felt the heat of life in his body. He knew that he was getting closer and closer to death, and subconsciously wanted to sit a little more comfortably. Perhaps it is a beautiful woman bathing in a wooden tub. Fan Xian laughed. Xiaowen looked at the young man and gently shook his head. Curiosity killed the old cat. You actually risked your life to save me for such an absurd reason, and ended up in a dead end. Do you regret it now? Fan Xian turned his head to look at the unfathomably deep cliff. He sighed and said nothing. Are you stupid? This was the second time Xiaowen had said this. He smiled. For a worthless secret, you buried your own life. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. That's right. In the face of death, all secrets are unimportant. Xiaowen suddenly looked at him strangely and said, Can I ask you a favor? Fan Xian's heart trembled. Although this old man was no longer as brave as he had been in the past, his status was still there. On his way north he had never asked for anything. What do you want to say? Xiaowen's voice was a little strange. I am not afraid of death, but after I die you will be trapped in this cave alone. I reckon that in the end, you will be so hungry that you will be interested in my corpse. Fan Xian was startled, but he understood what the old man was afraid of. He felt a little disgusted. Your old arms and legs. If I wanted to chew on your flesh, I would be afraid of breaking my own teeth. Xiaowen laughed bitterly. When you are really hungry, what can't you do? Fan Xian frowned. You're not even afraid of death, and you're afraid of me eating your flesh? Xiaowen stared at him. There are many people in this world who are not afraid of death, but they are afraid of cockroaches. He paused. I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid of being eaten by you after I die. That feeling is not good. The effects of the medicine had temporarily replenished Xiaowen's energy, so his speech had gradually become smoother. The wounds on his body had long since stopped bleeding, but the strange red in his eyes had deepened. This was not a good sign. Fan Xian looked at him and shook his head with a bitter smile. Don't worry. If you die, I will immediately throw you into the valley. His pupils suddenly contracted. He looked at Xiaowen and quietly asked, Old man, have you eaten human flesh before? The cave suddenly became quiet. For a long time Xiaowen's voice did not ring out. After a long while, the old man said expressionlessly, When I went to the temple, the mountains were sealed off by heavy snow. There was nothing to eat, so I had to eat human flesh. Fan Xian's heart thumped. Although he had dug up graves and dissected corpses since he was young, the thought of eating human flesh still made him feel disgusted. He unconsciously looked away from Xiaowen's withered lips. Xiaowen laughed strangely. Human flesh in fact is really disgusting, but what Ku he ate was much more delicious than what I had. Fan Xian's heart trembled again. Today the high and mighty Grandmaster revered by tens of thousands of people, the imperial advisor of northern Qi Ku he, had actually eaten human flesh? He immediately figured out the crux of the matter. Since Xiaowen knew where the temple was and Ku he was a disciple of the temple, then the two of them must have gone to the temple at the same time. For two great masters to have fallen to the point of eating the flesh of one another, one could only imagine the dangers of the journey. But he did not understand why Ku he had to kill Xiaowen. Was it just to hide the fact that he had eaten human flesh? When did you and Ku he go to the temple? Xiaowen unexpectedly closed his mouth. Fan Xian was like a diner, looking at a plate of duck skin noodles served by a waiter, and then watching the waiter take it away. Fan Xian's breath was stuck in his chest, unable to come out for a long time. He could not help but say angrily, Seeing that we are about to die, can't you let me die a little more happily? Xiaowen rolled his eyes at him and laughed mockingly. Are you stupid? Fan Xian sighed. For you this secret is no longer of any use to protect your life. Why bother hiding it? The temple is to the north. Very suddenly, very without warning, Xiaowen spoke. How far north? In the snowy lands of the extreme north. If you follow the northern prison pass, it will take you more than 3 months. At this time, the sky outside the cave was gradually darkening. Fan Xian's expression did not change, but his heart was a little nervous. He knew that he had finally succeeded halfway. At least he knew the general location of the temple. His heart slightly tightened. The mountain wind gradually picked up, and the summer chill on Mount Yen grew. He looked at Xiao En, who had closed his eyes and was waiting for death. Like a friend, he began to chat casually. "Dying old man, what do you think about the scenery of the temple?" Xiao En did not open his eyes. He lightly panted. "It's just a big temple. What scenery could there be? What about you? Which rock did you jump out of, kid?" Fan Xian yawned wearily and said, "I am from Danzhou, and Danzhou does not have much to look at. There are only 2 trees planted in the back garden of my house. One is a date tree and the other is also a date tree." Chapter 240. There are no trees in the temple. The temple is hidden within a snowy mountain. Legend has it that it only shows its true face for 2 days a year, and if one is not sincere, it is impossible to see it. Xiaowen's old voice was calm as he spoke. The temple had a very important meaning to him. Because he knew the relationship between the temple and that little girl, Qin Pingping had paid a great price to capture him back to the Qin kingdom. It was also because he knew the location of the temple that Ku He, who had benefited the most from the temple, wanted to silence him. The northern Qi emperor had extravagantly hoped to receive help from heaven from the temple. But what was the temple? It was nothing more than a temple. Xiao En suddenly felt that the first half of his life was fake. Only the second half of his life behind bars was real. The old man looked at the darkening sky outside the cave. "Master Fan, do you believe in the existence of God?" he asked with a wooden expression. Fan Xian was silent. He thought of his rebirth in the box. He nodded. "I believe in the existence of God more than anyone else in the world." "What is God?" "If I knew what God was, then I would be God." Xiaowen looked at him with admiration. "For someone as young as you to be able to see so clearly is rare." He paused. But His Majesty was still young at the time, so he did not see clearly. Fan Xian knew that the story was about to begin. He couldn't help but feel nervous and expectant. "Do you know what the world was like 30 years ago? The kingdom of Wei was powerful and could unify the world at any time." "Correct. At that time, I was already the leader of the Wei Kingdom's Red Cavalry, and His Majesty's confidant." Xiao En recalled the past, but his expression was strange. He didn't seem to be immersed in the glory of that day, nor did he bear any grudges. Perhaps because he was about to die, he was indifferent and calm. The world of that day was the world of the Kingdom of Wei. All of its talents were in the court. But the ones who truly stirred up the court, aside from the previous emperor, were 2 pairs of brothers. Fan Xian saw that the old man's expression seemed to be able to hold on, and he felt somewhat reassured. One of them was Yuan Zhuang Mohan. "Correct. That brother of mine was more promising than I was." Xiaowen's expression softened. "And he's more sentimental than I am. I was imprisoned by the kingdom of Qing for 20 years, but he still remembers me. I owe him." "Why doesn't anyone know that you 2 are brothers?" "The reason is simple. My reputation is too vicious, and who knows how many innocent people I've killed in secret. As a scholar, he naturally doesn't like me and I don't want to have anything to do with him," Xiaowen replied calmly. Fan Xian paused and changed the subject. "Who are the other pair of brothers?" "It's Zhan Qingfeng and Ku He." "Zhan Qingfeng?" "The father of the founding emperor of Northern Qi, a famous general of his generation?" Fan Xian was shocked. It turned out that Ku He was so close to the royal family of Northern Qi. No wonder back then he did his best to protect the current Empress Dowager and Emperor, and the royal family respected Ku He so much. Ku He is Zhan Qingfeng's younger brother. Ever since he was young, he was determined to become an ascetic monk, cultivating the way of the heavens. He strived to one day prove his way and enter the temple. Xiao En said sarcastically, "Most people believe in the temple, but who has actually seen it in the past 1,000 years? It's just that those ascetic monks preach the way everywhere, and their lives are even more pitiful than those of beggars." "But the temple really does exist," Fan Xian reminded him. "Correct." Xiaowen closed his eyes. At the time, the previous emperor had passed away, and the young emperor ascended to the throne. Although this emperor treated us courtiers fairly well, for some reason he was strangely afraid of death. All day long he wanted to practice the art of immortality. Fan Xian said, "At that time, Northern Wei was the strongest, and as the emperor, he had nothing to worry about. It was only natural that he would think of these things." Xiao En continued, "So at that time, Ku He took the opportunity to enter the palace and persuade His Majesty to send a diplomatic mission out to sea in search of the temple. He said that if the immortals of the temple taught His Majesty immortal magic, then he would naturally be able to live forever. When His Majesty heard this, there was no reason for him to refuse. He smiled bitterly. As His Majesty's trusted aide and leader of the Crimson Cavalry, this matter naturally fell on my head. Kuhi was the one who proposed it, and he was extremely fanatical about the temple. Naturally he would not stay out of it. Xiao En said lightly, after gathering the strength of the entire Wei Kingdom, and searching for who knows how long, we finally found a clue. So Kuhi and I led 1,000 men north. Although the dying old man spoke calmly, Fan Xian knew that the process must have been quite complicated. The temple was worshipped by the people of the world, but it was illusory and without a trace. To be able to find a definite clue was in itself a very astonishing matter. The old and indifferent voice echoed endlessly in the cave. Outside the cave, the light of the sky and the mountains gradually dimmed. Fan Xian listened in silence, and at the right moment he asked questions. His brain worked furiously. Through Xiaoen's memories, he drew a rough map of the route that the procession had taken to the temple. Time seemed to have returned to more than 30 years ago. The calm air of the yellow mountain outside the cave had turned into a blizzard. In the old man's memories, Fan Xian seemed to see an expedition consisting of 1,000 men. Through a sky full of wind and snow, they struggled to make their way through the incomparably wild north. They wore leather boots and thick leather clothing. Only their eyes were exposed, but they still could not stop the bone-chilling wind from pouring into their bodies. At the front of the procession were the two leaders of the group, Xiao En, who was in the prime of his life, and the young, pious ascetic monk Ku He. The further north the procession went, the more difficult it became. The further they went, the fewer people there were. Some people froze to death, some fell into icy valleys and disappeared, and some were crushed to death by birds of prey in the sky. In short, as the expedition progressed, the procession became shorter and shorter, and the atmosphere became more and more strange. The world was a sheet of white. Because they had stayed in this dry and cruel environment for too long, some of the people in the procession gradually became blind. They were heartlessly abandoned by Xiao En in the wilderness. In the distance, some direwolves that could withstand the cold waited for the blind people to die. Everything happened quietly, even if it was something as tragic as death. The procession walked for a long time and finally came to a large mountain in the extreme north. There was only a narrow path between the mountains, and the snow was so thick that it had long since obscured the color of the mountain. It looked like an endless chain of ice mountains. When the remaining 100 or so people entered the mountain, they found that behind the snowy mountain was still a world covered in ice and snow. Even the animals were few and far between. The procession set up camp with great tenacity, hoping to find traces of the temple here. But many days passed and they found nothing. Winter came. Heavy snow sealed the mountain. The sun went down. The strongest survived to the end. In the endless night, Xiao En and Ku He sat back to back in a tent. Around them were piles of corpses. The fire had not been extinguished. The remnants of the tent and the clothes of the dead gave the two of them a last glimmer of warmth, a glimmer of hope. That was the wrath of the heavens. In the cave, Xiao En opened his eyes with some difficulty. The scarlet color in his pupils became more and more intense, but there was endless fear in his eyes. The temple knows that mortals are trying to find them, so the heavens are angry and have sent endless darkness. Fan Xian looked at the old man. After a while he said quietly, that was called the polar night. He confirmed the location of the temple in his heart. Of course Xiao En did not know what the polar night was, but that memory was clearly deeply engraved in his mind. He said with a perplexed expression, at the time, Ku He was eating human flesh in an extremely sweet and stingy manner. He was praying piously to the heavens. I couldn't help but despise him. Unexpectedly. Perhaps in the end he really did move the immortals in the temple, and so the sky suddenly brightened. Fan Xian couldn't help but look at Xiao En. He wondered how the two of them had been able to survive in the polar night that lasted for months. Even if they had human flesh to eat and tents to burn, that kind of loneliness and struggle between the two of them would have probably driven them mad. Xiao En suddenly laughed and said, the sky brightened in an instant. At that time, Ku He and I were at the end of our lives. But suddenly we found hope. We didn't know where the power came from, but it supported us to continue living. And then you found the temple. Fan Xian picked up the dagger and put it by his side. He asked quietly, what was the temple like? Many years ago, outside the snowy mountains, two people so thin they were only bones. With great difficulty they walked out of their tents. Their sunken eyes and sallow complexions, and their swollen gums as they breathed, all revealed one thing: they were about to die. The light of the day was finally not so stingy. After coming out for a while, some animals awoke from their caves. Although the two of them were already arrows at the end of their flight, they were still much more ferocious than the wild beasts. So they were able to replenish themselves and stand up again. That day they narrowed their eyes and looked at the snowy mountains in front of them in a daze. They had no idea where the temple they had been so painstakingly searching for was. Here there was only a vast expanse of white. It was very clean. Suddenly, a ray of light shone down from the dark blue sky. The light from the snowy mountains twisted strangely. Very suddenly, a beautiful temple appeared out of thin air in the mountains. This grand temple was built against the mountain. The black stone walls and the light gray eaves supported each other. It was indescribably dignified. Kuhi stared at the mountains in a daze. Suddenly he fell to the ground in agitation. He looked in the direction of the temple and burst into tears. Xiao En stood there dumbfounded. A moment later he woke up and sat down in the snow. He didn't have the strength to stand up for a long time. This was the temple. Chapter 241. Kuhi, still a young man, and Xiao En, with a face full of shock, began to climb up the snowy mountain. Their faces were no longer frozen by the wind and snow that filled the sky. Instead, they were filled with a complex mix of emotions: excitement, joy, nervousness, excitement, and a faint sense of fear. There was no fear on Kuhi's face, only incomparable fanaticism. He was an ascetic monk, and his whole life he had longed to be able to touch the door of the temple with his own hands, to be able to gently kowtow to the stone steps in front of the temple. The vast universe on the snowy mountain seemed very close, but when the two of them tried to approach it, they discovered that the temple was an extremely distant existence. After climbing for a long time, they felt that the temple was getting further and further away. Those black, solemn stone walls were like an illusory shadow that could vanish into the snowy mountain at any moment. According to legend, the temple only appeared twice a year. Kuhi and Xiao En did not want to give up on this opportunity, so they used all their strength to climb up the snowy mountain. They didn't know how long they had climbed, but their bodies were covered in cuts from the icicles. They were dripping with blood, and they left 2 faint lines of blood on the snowy ground. With a clap, Kuhi's palm finally touched the stone steps in front of the temple. The young ascetic monk could not help but impudently clap twice, expressing the ecstasy and indescribable excitement in his heart. Xiao En was slower than him. He secretly gripped the hidden weapon in his sleeve, and looked at the main door of the temple with a trace of fear. This door was at least 7 meters tall, like a book that a god had thrown into the mortal world. The door in the Wei Kingdom's palace looked like a miniature version of the door of the temple. It was far less grand and majestic than this temple. It was indeed not a place for mortals to live. The stone walls of the temple were covered in dust. It must have been many years since anyone had come to visit this most mysterious place in the world. Xiao En swallowed and prepared to find a way to enter the temple. He had been entrusted with an important task by the emperor, and had requested the recipe for immortality. Now that success was at hand, he was naturally excited. But Kuhi was not like him. He very devoutly knelt in front of the temple, constantly kowtowing. Gradually, blood began to seep from his forehead. He walked towards the door of the temple and stretched out his hand, but he could not touch the giant door. It seemed that as his fingertips moved forward, the giant door was retreating in a strange way. The divine temple was right in front of them, but it was far away. 30 years later, in the cave, the dying Shan's eyes were filled with a trace of sadness. I couldn't get in. Fan Xian loosened his tightly clenched hands and quietly said, "This is something that can be imagined. Otherwise, the 4 great grandmasters would become the 5 great grandmasters. Kuhi is stronger than me. Even if I had his luck, I would not be able to enter the realm of a great grandmaster." Xiao En shook his head. But Kuhi was not able to enter either. That temple seemed to be protected by some mysterious power. Back then, Kuhi and I were the strongest warriors in the world, and yet we were unable to enter. Fan Xian came to a realization. Among the secrets of the world, teacher Fei Jie had once mentioned that Kuhi had knelt on the stone steps in front of the temple for a long time before he gained the power to dominate a region. It seemed that this rumor was somewhat true. He suddenly furrowed his brows and asked, "What exactly is a temple?" This was a question that Xiao En could not answer. The old man said weakly, "There is a large plaque at the front door of the divine temple. But it is very old and I cannot make out what is written on it. I suspect that it is a rune left behind by the heavens." Fan Xian's heart trembled. "What kind of rune is it?" Xiao En looked at the excited Fan Xian and his eyebrows twitched. It seemed that this young man on the brink of death was still so curious about the unknown. He was a little interested. It is the character, Wu. The old man stretched out his finger with some difficulty and gestured in the air. Fan Xian immediately understood and said to himself, "The hidden dragon does not use?" As soon as the words left his mouth, he laughed in spite of himself. "There are 3 identical runes," Xiao En continued. His finger moved up and down in the air and then up and down again, drawing 2 arcs. His fingertips pierced through the air, giving off a mysterious feeling. Fan Xian was a little surprised. He knew that he could not discover anything from such simple runes. Did the divine temple have anything to do with his rebirth? Did it have anything to do with his mother? It seemed that he would have to wait for the future to find out. But he might not be as lucky as Ku He and Xiao En, who would be able to survive the long polar night. "I don't think the story ends so simply." Xiao En coughed. "That's right. When a goal that you have so painstakingly pursued is right in front of you, but you can never reach it, you will always feel a strong sense of dissatisfaction." Ku He very sincerely knelt on the stone steps in front of the divine temple, and I began to slowly walk towards the high wall on the side of the mountain. Outside the cave, the darkness enveloped the 2 of them. There was no fire, so there was no light. Xiao En's indifferent voice recounted the events of decades ago, and it seemed very strange. Fan Xian suddenly said in a soft voice, "You were looking for a sewer?" Xiao En looked at the young man's silhouette at the mouth of the cave. "You were in the same profession. Of course you knew what I would have done. You couldn't even get close to the wall. How could you have entered the divine temple through a sewer? Besides..." Fan Xian frowned. "For a place like this left behind by the heavens, it is not certain that there would be a sewer." "So I failed," Xiao En said straightforwardly. "Now that I think about it, I was very brave at the time. Facing the divine temple, I still thought of these earthly methods. And then? Xiao En sank into a very strange mood. "Then I walked back to the main entrance of the divine temple, and found that Ku He was putting something in his pocket. I was a little curious, and just as I was about to ask him about it..." The old man's speech slowed and Fan Xian's heart jumped. The door of the divine temple opened. "Ha!" Fan Xian subconsciously moved a little closer to Xiao En, as if he wanted to protect this guy from 30 years ago. An absurd smile appeared in Xiao En's eyes. In a hoarse voice he said, "The door of the divine temple opened without a sound. I was overjoyed, and just as I was about to enter from the world's largest door, a most wonderful person suddenly ran out." "The most wonderful person?" "Yes, it was a little fairy." Xiao En stood stupidly outside the door of the divine temple, watching helplessly as a little girl rushed into his arms. He almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ku He rush to the door of the divine temple like a ferocious tiger, tangling with a black light inside the divine temple. The young Ku He was already the youngest superior 9th-level master in the world. At this moment he was stimulated by some unknown reason, and the power within his body was completely unleashed to the peak. He was actually entangled with the mysterious black shadow inside the divine temple. Qi flew in all directions and the snow was thrown into chaos. After a few breaths, Xiao En remembered that there was a little girl in his arms. Before he could react, he heard the little girl shout to Ku He, who was on the bluestone steps, "Retreat!" It was a very simple word, but coming from the mouth of the little girl, it was as if she was the ruler of a generation. No one could question her. That kind of natural power made Xiao En's heart tremble, and then he received a slap in the face. "You retreat too." Ku He floated away and Xiao En, holding the little girl in his arms, tumbled down the stone steps. He was 30 meters away from the main door of the divine temple. The black light suddenly shrank back into the divine temple and did not pursue. Xiao En looked at the giant door with lingering fear. He thought that the black light seemed to be a human figure, and he could not help but be afraid, because Ku He was now beside him, spitting up blood. Even Ku He was not a match for the other. The people inside the divine temple could not be viewed with the eyes of mortals. He came to a realization very quickly. It must have been that when he went to find the sewers, Ku He, who was kneeling on the bluestone steps, and the little girl in his arms had come to some kind of agreement to help her escape from the divine temple. But, who was this little girl? "Hold me, pull him, go." The little girl seemed to be a little afraid of the cold, and buried her face in Xiao En's chest. Xiao En did not dare to be negligent. He grabbed Ku He by the collar and ran down the snowy mountain. He did not know how long they ran, but he finally ran back to his tent. It was not until he sat down in his tent, panting, that he came to his senses. Why did he run? The elixir of immortality that His Majesty wanted had not yet arrived. Why did he listen to this little girl? And strangely enough, the immortals in the divine temple did not chase him. Shaoan turned around and saw the little girl crouching, pinching her nose, looking at the leftover human bones in the corner of the tent. What a pitiful and hateful human. The little girl turned around and looked at Shaoan. It was only now that Shaoan could see her face clearly. Clear as water, pure as snow, eyes like stars. She was a beauty that no mortal should have. In the darkness of the cave, Fan Xian's expression could not be seen, but his voice was a little strange. How old was that little girl? 4 years old. At most 4 years old. Shaoan's eyes were open, and it was as if he could still see that beautiful face. When I held her in my arms, I felt that she was so light it was like she did not exist. Fan Xian was a little confused. Also 4 years old? Why do you say also? It's nothing. Fan Xian smiled and his eyes lit up. Do you know who that little girl is? Shaoan spoke with absolute certainty. Of course I do. She is a little girl who longs for the world of mortals, so she ran out of the divine temple. Fan Xian laughed and shook his finger. Believe me, she is just a little girl who ran into the divine temple to steal things. Chapter 242. Hearing Fan Xian's confident words, Shaoan began to cough violently for a long time. It was the middle of the night, and he didn't know if the brocade guards searching below could hear him. Fan Xian was a little worried. He took out a thin needle and probed it into Shaoan's neck to help soothe the pulse of his heart. Fan Xian's fingers gently rested on Shaoan's neck, and he felt a slight wetness and stickiness. He sniffed and smelled blood. He knew that Shaoan had begun to cough up blood. His face was expressionless, but his heart was stirred. That was a fairy. The dying old man stubbornly confirmed the judgment he had made 30 years ago. Fan Xian didn't want to argue with him on this matter. How could a 4-year-old girl carry a trunk? Who was carrying that trunk? What trunk? Shaoan's voice was straight, and it didn't seem like he was lying. Fan Xian was a little surprised. He knew that there was no need for him to hide anything, and Wu Zhu had not yet appeared. Wu Zhu had once said that he and his mother had left home together. Where was that home? According to the letter his mother had left behind, Wu Zhu had once fought with the strong men of the temple, and had lost part of his memory. Why would Wu Zhu fight with the men of the temple? Was it jealousy? What happened after that? This was the duty of all who listened to the story. Shaoan, the old storyteller, was about to die. Fan Xian naturally wouldn't forget to ask this question. Inside the tent, Ku He lay on top of the fur. His breathing was a little ragged. He didn't know what the 4-year-old girl had promised him, but it had caused him to go against his beliefs and dare to attack the men of the temple. Shaoan looked at the little girl who had lifted the flap of the tent and was looking out into the snow. The wind and snow had not lessened, and the little girl's skin was whiter than snow. Her small hands gripped the thick tent cloth tightly. She was so small, and looking out into the vast world, she felt a sense of loneliness that did not match her age. Carefully, he moved to Ku He's side, and put his hand into the opening of Ku He's robe. That's what I gave him. The little girl didn't even turn her head. Don't touch it. Shan looked at the little girl, and a fierce glint suddenly appeared in his eyes. What Ku He was hiding in his bosom must be some sort of heavenly book from the temple. Shaoan could not help but be tempted. But when he remembered that the little girl was a fairy who had sneaked out of the temple, Shaoan immediately gave up on the idea. He knelt down respectfully and kowtowed to the little fairy at the door, saying, I am the commander of the Discipline Commission of Dawei. Under the orders of His Majesty, I have come to the temple to listen to the heavenly edict. I beg the heavenly deity to grant me the elixir of immortality. This was Shan's mission, and he had not forgotten it. The girl at the door laughed when she heard that. She laughed very happily. After a while she suddenly threw a pill at Shan. You helped me, so I'll help you too. Since that monk has benefited, you should benefit too. Shaoan took the pill and examined it carefully. He couldn't see anything special about it, but since it was a gift from a fairy, he couldn't ignore it. He took out the jade box and carefully placed it inside. You should go back. The little girl's tone was somewhat old-fashioned. There's no point in staying here. Shaoan was a little disappointed. They had finally found the temple, but they hadn't entered. He didn't know what the immortals inside looked like. Thank you, fairy, for the pill. Don't come here again, the little girl suddenly said softly. And don't tell anyone where the temple is. If I find out that you have revealed the location of the temple, I will kill you. The little girl turned around, her young face full of frost. Do you hear me? Xiao En bowed his head in agreement. Although such cold words came out of the mouth of a little girl who looked like she was carved from ice and snow, the fact that a 4-year-old girl could speak so clearly proved that she was not an ordinary person. Even though Xiao En was the leader of the Tiki of Dawei, he still didn't dare disobey. The old man had no choice but to obey. After Ku He woke up, the fairy forced the two of us to swear a deadly oath. Then we began to head south. During those few days, the smile on the fairy's face gradually grew. It was as if she thought that stepping into the world of mortals was a very interesting thing. Xiao En continued to recollect. It's strange. Every time Ku He and I looked at her back, we couldn't feel any mysterious power within her. There is a difference between immortals and mortals. We are mortals and we can't understand. Then one day the fairy turned around and looked at the snowy mountain behind her. She suddenly said to herself, "He's too pitiful." I remember those words very clearly, because I have never seen such compassion on a mortal's face. Of course, Fan Xian knew that his mother wasn't some fairy. At the time, she probably didn't have much power, but she was able to scare two of the world's most powerful beings. That brain of hers was quite good. But he didn't understand who his mother was referring to when she said, "too pitiful." And he didn't believe in compassion. He couldn't help but laugh. Xiao En mocked, "You and I are rats that live in the gutters. How could we know the beauty of a crane in the clouds of the ninth heaven?" I can't describe the look in the fairy's eyes, but Ku He and I could never forget it. Fan Xian was silent. The next day the fairy suddenly disappeared. I don't know where she went. In that cold, endless snow, she suddenly disappeared without a trace. Ku He and I were scared half to death. In the cave, Xiao En gasped for breath as he recalled. It was the most mysterious adventure of my life. To be able to see a fairy that didn't belong to this world, I was lucky. And then you and Ku He returned to Northern Way? Fan Xian asked. That's right. The journey back was more dangerous than when we left. But in short, we came back safely. Xiao En said, I gave the pill that the fairy bestowed upon me to His Majesty, and that was the end of the matter. Fan Xian said, Don't lie to me. That pill must have fallen into your stomach a long time ago. Xiao En laughed hoarsely. I knew I couldn't lie to you. Fan Xian said, Where in this world can there be an elixir of immortality? That kind of temptation is something that no normal person could resist. Xiao En sighed. Of course, after I took the pill, I realized that it only improved my constitution. There was no way I could live forever. Only then did I realize that the fairy could also lie. I believe that the fairy loved to lie, Fan Xian said, a little absent-minded. Perhaps even her death was a lie. What death? Xiao En said. How could a fairy die? Fan Xian ignored him. He closed his eyes and committed Xiao En's recollection to memory. Then he stood up and gripped the dagger. There was no light all around. Dark clouds covered the stars and the moon. It was so dark that Xiao En couldn't see his movements. Why did Ku He want you dead? This was Fan Xian's last question. I don't think that knowing the location of the temple could cause such a huge uproar. Xiao En felt that Fan Xian's question was strange. Everyone knows what the temple means to the world. If such an important piece of news were to spread, I'm afraid the world would be thrown into chaos. Whether it's the child of the Zhan family of the kingdom of Qi or the sinister emperor of the Qing kingdom, they would all send troops to the north to pay their respects. The strongest of the world would constantly try to find the temple. Fan Xian rubbed his nose. The temple? You've been there and you said it was just a big temple. What was there to pay respects to? Xiao En laughed coldly. Ku He only knelt in front of the temple, and then he became the greatest grandmaster in the world. For a martial cultivator, this kind of temptation is unimaginably strong, and do you really think that Ku He is a saint? Seeing him kneel so piously in front of the temple, but the fairy only gave him a book, and in the blink of an eye, he overthrew the temple he had believed in all his life and took the risk to attack. In the face of profit, he is just a great villain who is good at pretending. Xiao En continued, If he kills me, he will be the only one in the world who knows where the temple is. What is in the temple? Perhaps Ku He will never know, but he has already reaped enough benefits. So why would he take the risk and allow the other strongest of the world to have this opportunity? Fan Xian thought about it. This was indeed the case, and he vaguely understood why Ku He was so obsessed with killing Xiao En. Perhaps it was to protect his glorious image as the imperial advisor, and not to expose the ugly things he had done on the journey north. Perhaps Ku He knew what was in the temple, and that it would bring unknown dangers to the world. What is in the temple? Fan Xian sank into deep thought. His finger unconsciously traced the word Shaoan had spoken of, the word do, at the door of the temple. His finger gradually sped up, and there was a sound of rushing wind. For 1,000 years, the world has known that the temple does not meddle in worldly affairs. He and I going to find it was already a very risky gamble. Reality has proven that so long as we leave the temple, the people in the temple will not cause trouble for the people of the world. He is the protector of northern Qi. How would he dare to take the risk of offending the heavens? Shaoan's energy was gradually waning, and his voice was getting quieter and quieter. But the fear in his voice still lingered. Furthermore, the fairy forced us to swear a deadly oath. Even if He always boasted that he was the one closest to the heavens, would he dare to break his oath? Don't take things like oaths too seriously, said Fan Xian. Didn't you tell me the location of the temple? That's because I am going to die. Shaoan turned his head to the side with some difficulty. And you will die in this cave. Fan Xian smiled apologetically. I don't think so. Chapter 243. In the silent night of the valley, there were no weeds as far as the eye could see. Instead, there was a dark night sky that stretched between two precipitous walls. Fan Xian tidied up his clothes and tied up his torn left trouser leg as he said in a quiet voice, I'm sorry. That fairy's surname is Yi. Her name is Yi Qingmei. Yi Qingmei? Shaoan was shocked. What did you say? Could it be that the mistress of the Yi family is the fairy I once met? When the Yi family suddenly rose to prominence, Shaoan was still the head of Northern Wei's secret service, so it was no surprise to Fan Xian that he knew the name of the mistress of the Yi family. He smiled. Aside from the fairy you speak of, who else could have the Yi family change the state of the world in a few short years? So that's how it is. Shaoan coughed again. No wonder the kingdom of Qing could rise so fiercely. So there was the shadow of the temple behind it. Wrong, Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, you are already a person about to die, so let me tell you Yi Qingmei the fairy you speak of, is not an immortal from the temple. She is like us, just a normal person. Shaoan had not yet recovered from his earlier shock. He did not believe what Fan Xian had said. Instead, he was immersed in his last question before he died. Why did the fairy want to capture me and bring me to the kingdom of Qing? As the head of Northern Wei's secret service, he naturally knew the relationship between the Yi family and the Overwatch Council of the kingdom of Qing. The kingdom of Qing had to kill you back then, said Fan Xian. He paused. I must admit that back then you were a very terrifying person. And the reason why Yi Qingmei sent Qin Pingping to capture you instead of killing you must have been because of your friendship back then. After all, it seems that it was because you broke into the temple that she came to this world. Then, just who, are you? In the darkness, Shaoan's eyes stared at Fan Xian like two sharp arrows. For an old comrade on the verge of death to still have such sharp eyes, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little startled. He chuckled. Me? After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth. I am Yi Qingmei's son. Yi Qingmei's son. How Fan Xian wanted to be able to say it aloud to everyone in this familiar yet strange, intimate yet inharmonious world. Unfortunately, there was no such possibility right now. The night was getting darker and the darkness before dawn had arrived. In a cave with only the two of them, Fan Xian spoke quietly and faintly. I am Yi Qingmei's son. For some reason, the moment these words left his mouth, Fan Xian felt much more relaxed. His heart, which had borne too much pressure, struggled free of the many branches and vines on it in an instant. At least, it obtained a temporary relaxation and gently embraced the taste of freedom in the night wind. The sky gradually brightened. There weren't many memories, but Shaoan spoke very slowly. After a day and a half, Fan Xian had finally achieved the most important goal of his journey north. He looked at Shaoan and said quietly, Do you have anything to tell me? Shaoan just looked at him with a strange expression. After a while he gasped and said, You are her son? Fan Xian nodded and smiled. I don't have the habit of calling someone my mother. Shaoan coughed violently, shaking out the last few drops of blood in his heart. He seemed to be crying and laughing at the same time. No wonder you know so many things. No wonder you are so interested in the location of the temple. Before he died, the old man finally saw everything clearly. Gasping for breath, he said, It seems that this cave won't be able to hold you. I don't have the habit of throwing myself into a death trap. Fan Xian had already prepared everything. He moved closer to Shaoan. Shaoan suddenly stared fixedly into his eyes. If you want to live well, don't go to the temple. Fan Xian's face was calm. He didn't reply. Shaoan didn't look at him again either. He only turned his gaze to the precipice behind Fan Xian. He frowned slightly as if thinking about something. After a while the old man gasped softly. I used to think that I was a ruthless man who didn't fear death. I only sought freedom. Now that death is right in front of me, I know that everyone is afraid of death. There is no one in this world who isn't afraid of death. For some reason Fan Xian looked at the dying Shaoan and slowly loosened his right hand. He said softly, but, perhaps death is not the end. Perhaps you will go to a completely unfamiliar world. This was his greatest secret, his greatest regret. Shaoan's gaze fell into the distance. His bloodshot eyes gradually softened. Are you really the son of the little fairy? No Yi Qingmei? Without waiting for Fan Xian to reply, Shaoan continued indifferently. But you don't look like her at all. Fan Xian said, you've only seen her when she was 4. How can you be so sure? Shaoan smiled. Because you are far less beautiful than the little fairy. Fan Xian subconsciously tilted his head. In this world there are not many women more beautiful than me. The look in your eyes is different. How is it different? Shaoan looked at him. With a hint of coldness he said, only now do I understand. On that snowy wasteland, the little fairy gazed at the vast white earth. Her eyes were still soft and compassionate. I never knew how to describe it, but now I seem to feel the coming of that darkness. Only then do I understand that all the emotions in her eyes were expressing one thing. What is it? Fan Xian's heart jumped. The love and attachment to life. Shaoan smiled and said, although there is always a bright smile in your eyes, it is not the same. Your mother should be an extremely sentimental person, but you are an extremely heartless person. Fan Xian smiled. I don't deny that. I've killed many people in my life, so I never expected to have a good death. Shaoan did not continue this topic. He looked at the misty sky in a trance. To be able to die in this cave, as you say, a good grave is not bad. Fan Xian half squatted by his side and put his left hand on the old man's shoulder. He found that the old man's muscles had gradually softened. The sky outside the precipice was still dim, but through the mist that pervaded the valley, a holy light could be seen. This light shone softly on Shaoan's withered face. It made this secret agent, whose hands were stained with blood, and who had spent the latter half of his life alone and miserable, feel a sense of relief. Danzhou doesn't have those 2 date trees, does it? This was the last thing Shaoan would ask in this world. Fan Xian took the last needle from under the old man's ear. After a moment he confirmed that he was dead. He tilted his head slightly and looked at Shaoan's body. Suddenly, in a soft voice he said, although Danzhou doesn't have those 2 date trees, perhaps there is a better world waiting for you after you die. Shaoan's eyes had already softly closed. His pupils were bloodshot and he could no longer look at this strange world. Fan Xian let out a murky breath and laid Shaoan's body flat in the deepest part of the shallow cave. As for whether or not there would be any eagles pecking at him, it seemed that he had not considered that, so he appeared somewhat cold and emotionless. He walked out of the cave and reached out his hand into the air outside the precipice. The white mountain mist moved along with his fingers, and all he caught was empty air. The brocade guard should still be searching for the bodies or traces of the old man and the young man at the bottom of the valley. The precipice of Swallow Mountain was as smooth as a mirror. No one would have thought that someone would be able to jump off the cliff and stand steadily. And no one would have thought that someone would be able to climb up the slippery and wet mountain walls. Fan Xian's whole body was like a piece of paper, tightly pressed against the mountain wall. Behind him was the thick morning mist, effectively concealing his figure. Even if someone was on the opposite side of the mountain wall, they would not be able to discover that he was slowly climbing up like a gecko. When he was in Danzhou from the age of 12 to 16, he had spent a full 4 years controlling his jinqi outside his body. This was an extremely foolish method of cultivation, but Wu Zhu did not care. Fan Xian practiced it to his heart's content. Unexpectedly, later on in Fan Xian's life, it had helped him so much. Crawling like a gecko, sticking close like a snake, Fan Xian carefully climbed up and up and up, his face expressionless. The effects of the ephedra pill had long since faded, and his jinqi was somewhat lacking, so he did not dare to be careless. The shallow grass rustled slightly, and a hand clung to a rock beside the precipice. A person covered from head to toe in black night clothing climbed out of the valley like a ghost. Fan Xian's face was covered by a hat. He turned his head and saw that the valley was quiet as if nothing had happened. After a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Through the thick morning mist, he gazed at the mountain forest, but he could see nothing. But he felt as if someone was watching him, and that person's gaze seemed to be fixed on him. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and turned around. He did not think, nor did he have time to think. Like a black arrow, he plunged into the thick mist, running in the direction of the capital. Outside the residence of the diplomatic mission in the capital, Gauda held a long knife in his hand. His eyes were as round as a fierce tiger's as he stared at the people in front of the courtyard. The young master had not left the house for a day and night, and all visits from Northern Qi officials had been refused. But early that morning, someone from the brocade guard had come to deliver an edict from the palace, saying that the young emperor wanted Fan Xian to enter the palace for a chat. Few people knew that Fan Xian was not with the diplomatic mission. The commander of the brocade guard, Xinzhong, hoped that Fan Xian was not with the diplomatic mission, but after a night of searching, Fan Xian's body had not been found. So Northern Qi finally became suspicious, and so they urgently wanted to know where Fan Xian was. Who would have thought that the people of Qing would be so rude and unreasonable? Using Fan Xian's drunkenness as an excuse, they forcibly prevented the Northern Qi officials from entering the diplomatic mission. Conflict was about to break out, but at that moment, a rustling sound came from the end of the street. It was not the sound of street sweeps but footsteps. The Northern Qi officials were overjoyed. Chapter 244. The morning in Shangjing was bustling. Several groups of people had arrived at the entrance of the diplomatic mission. The Northern Qi officials and the brocade guard parted to make a path. They bowed respectfully to the girl who had leisurely approached. "Greetings, Miss Haitang." Haitang's eyes were drowsy as if she hadn't woken up yet. Her hands were still in the pockets of her flowery dress. She yawned and asked, "What are you all doing here?" One of the officials hurried forward to report, "I have come by imperial edict to invite Sir Fan Xian into the palace, but Sir Fan's bodyguard refused to announce his arrival." More officials from the brocade guard and Honglu Temple came forward to report their intentions. In short, they all wanted to see Fan Xian. Haitang was slightly startled. She didn't seem to know that so many things had happened in Shangjing in the past 2 days. There was a trace of confusion in her eyes. "Why didn't you announce it?" Tiger Guard Gauda knew that although this girl looked like a country bumpkin, she was actually an important figure in Northern Qi. More importantly, during the days the diplomatic mission had been in Shangjing, his young master had often wandered the streets with this strange woman, so he didn't dare to slight her. He stepped forward and said in a low voice, "Sir Fan drank too much last night, so he is not feeling well. He is resting and it would not be good to disturb him." Haitang muttered to herself for a moment, then said quietly, "Let me take a look." Having said this, she walked toward the front door of the diplomatic mission. These days she had often come to the diplomatic mission to find Fan Xian, so the people of the diplomatic mission had long since become accustomed to her presence. Seeing her stride inside, Lin Wen, who was standing on the stone steps, couldn't help but feel a trace of panic flash through his eyes, but he didn't dare to stop her. Gauda, however, was wholeheartedly protective of his master. He frowned and gripped the cloth hilt of his long knife. He stood in front of Haitang and said in a low voice, "Miss, His last word turned into a muffled grunt. Haitang didn't make a move. She just turned her body slightly. Her cloth shoes, which never seemed to leave the ground, made a rustling sound. For some reason she was already behind Gauda's Jinchi, which had been accumulating for a long time, couldn't find an outlet. His shoulders trembled slightly and his eyes shone brightly. Haitang smiled and turned to gently pat his shoulder. A strange expression flashed across her ordinary face. "Fan Xian and I are friends. I think he will be willing to see me now." When her palm was about to land on Gauda's shoulder, an extremely gentle and warm current flowed into him. Gauda slowly closed his eyes. His right hand exerted strength between his thumb and forefinger. The long saber by his side made a sharp sound as it fiercely stabbed into the stone floor beside his feet. The gravel was slightly scattered, and the tip of the saber was more than 3 inches into the ground. In this exchange, although Gauda was extremely skilled, he was still no match for Haitang's realm. Moreover, Haitang's identity was rather special, so he was actually unable to make a move and suffered a loss. Gauda knew that he could not stop Haitang, but he was unwilling to let the young master in the room face Haitang alone. Thus, with a dark expression, he turned and followed the swaying figure into the courtyard. Behind them, the Northern Qi officials and brocade guards did not follow. As long as Haitang could confirm whether or not Fan Xian was in the room, it would be fine. There was no need for them to take the risk. "Good morning, Miss Haitang." Wang Qinian, holding a bowl of salt water and a miniature mace in his hand, appeared in the long corridor of the courtyard that Haitang had to pass through. This trusted aide of Fan Xian had seen Haitang a few times and could be considered to be familiar with her. Haitang smiled slightly. She knew that he was here to stall for time, but she was not in a hurry. "What is that in Sir Wang's hand?" Wang Qinian took out the miniature mace from his mouth and extended it in front of Haitang. He laughed and said, "My master invented the toothbrush." "Toothbrush?" Haitang was slightly surprised. "Brushing your teeth?" "Yes." "Why not use willow branches?" "Because this thing is easy to use. It's soft and the brush is exquisite," Wang Qinian said in an ingratiating manner. Only now did he realize that placing the toothbrush that had come into contact with his foul mouth in front of Haitang was a very disrespectful thing to do. He quickly took it back and repeatedly apologized. Haitang smiled bitterly, shook her head and walked inside. Wang Qinian tossed the bowl and the utensils to his subordinate and eagerly followed. He was almost 40 years old and he ran faster than a rabbit. As he walked he chatted with Haitang. He also said that Fan Xian had drunk too much yesterday and was probably still resting. How about she come back later? Actually, everyone knew that Haitang's sudden appearance in the diplomatic mission this early in the morning could not have been a coincidence. She had to see Fan Xian. In the distance of the corridor, a figure dressed in white was looking at the two of them. Haitang was moved. She turned her head and a chill filled her eyes. So it is the great scholar Yun. Yan Bingyun could see that this last disciple of Ku he was not in a good mood. Although he had been released by the brocade guard, he had always carefully hidden himself in the back of the residence, not wanting to provoke the officials and people of northern Qi. Before he had been imprisoned, Haitang had returned to the palace, and he had met her as the great scholar Yun. Meeting Haitang today made him feel a little awkward and he silently retreated. Looking at the tightly shut wooden door in front of her, Haitang frowned and reached out to push it open. She was a young woman, and although everyone knew that she had some friendship with Fan Xian, pushing open the door like this was not very polite. Wang Qinian jumped in fright and tried to block the door. But while his qinggong was excellent, there was a huge gap between him and this woman. A gust of wind blew past and the wooden door creaked open. A drop of cold sweat dripped from Wang Qinian's forehead. He didn't know if he would make it in time. Haitang looked calmly at the large bed in the room. Suddenly she said, "Sir Wang, you may leave." Wang Qinian did not move. A tired, cold voice came from the room. "Wang Qinian, you may leave." Wang Qinian took a deep breath, and a look of joy appeared in his eyes. He immediately calmed down and bowed. "Yes, Sir Fan." Haitang walked in with light steps and the wooden door closed behind her. She did not seem surprised, nor was she in a hurry. She took a teapot from the table, poured some cold tea into a cup and sipped it lightly. Then she sat down on a round stool next to the bed. On the bed, under the brocade quilt, Fan Xian's face was pale, and his eyes were smiling. He looked at the village girl sitting by his bed with great interest. After a moment he said, "Are you going to keep looking like this?" Haitang covered her mouth with her hand and yawned. "If it weren't for the Empress Dowager asking me to take a look, do you think I would be happy to come early in the morning and see your ugly state?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "As for my appearance, although I don't like it very much, I know it has nothing to do with the word ugly." He lowered his head to glance at it and then said, "I believe that she is not ugly." Under the quilt, Fan Xian's robe was pulled open, and in his naked chest was a beautiful woman with long hair like a black waterfall. Drinking with women for a day and a night. Haitang didn't seem to see the woman in his arms and yawned again. "She's not very beautiful. Are you going to keep looking like this?" "It seems to me that Sir Fan has no intention of stopping me from looking," Haitang said with a smile. In the end it was Fan Xian who became embarrassed. "Excuse me for a moment so that the woman in my arms can put on her clothes." He calmly said, "You don't have to give me face but you have to give the woman face. Women, why make things difficult for women?" After the courtesan finished packing, she looked back at Fan Xian with reluctance. The slight resentment, shyness, and charm in her eyes made Fan Xian praise her acting skills. The courtesan bowed to Haitang with a trace of reverence, then pulled up the hem of her dress and walked out of the room, leaving Haitang and Fan Xian alone. Fan Xian was still lying on the bed, his hands behind his head. He didn't care that Haitang had seen his naked upper body. Haitang was a clever person. She didn't pretend to be shy, nor did she scold him. She acted as if the young man on the bed was a block of wood. She directly said, "Do you know what happened in Shangjing these past 2 days?" Fan Xian was startled, but after a moment he laughed. Forget it. I can't be bothered to waste words with you. Since I'm in Shangjing, how can I not know? Shang Shanhu lost a group of subordinates this time and Shaoan was killed by you. I'm sure your teacher will be very happy. Congratulations, Mississippi. Haitang looked at him calmly, and the pressure in her eyes grew stronger and stronger. But Fan Xian didn't seem to feel it at all. He still smiled. Yes, I knew this would happen, so in order to avoid suspicion, I had to lock myself up in the diplomatic mission for 2 days. I'm sure you understand. Haitang didn't know whether he was telling the truth or not, but earlier in the courtyard she had given Fan Xian enough time by taking advantage of Wang Qingyan's delay. No one knew why Haitang was willing to do this. Since Fan Xian was in the diplomatic mission, Haitang knew she wouldn't be able to get any more information out of him. This young southern official in front of her, who looked like a beautiful young official, was actually a watertight person. Naturally, she wouldn't be able to catch any clues. She stood up and put her hands in her large pockets. Suddenly, she looked at Fan Xian's naked upper body with interest. Fan Xian stealthily circulated his tyrannical jinqi, and his beautiful face blushed. Why are you blushing? Haitang asked with a smile. You're glowing. Fan Xian suddenly felt an indescribable danger approaching. A day and 2 nights of mental exhaustion caused his face to immediately turn deathly white. Why are you white again? Fan Xian took a deep breath and smiled. The night of spring is bitter. Chapter 245. Isn't the spring night too short? Too long is also a pain. The toothbrush you made. I want one. Fan Xian was stunned. He hadn't expected her to make such a request. He smiled bitterly. As far as I know, you can buy them on Xiushui Street. Haitang smiled. Not as good as you. Thank you for the compliment. I didn't think a noble child like you would be willing to spend so much time on such things. Haitang looked at Fan Xian as if to re-evaluate him. Fan Xian slowly closed his eyes and said, It is clear that you do not know enough about me. Haitang was silent for a moment. But I only know that after the Empress Dowager's birthday, you will return home. What about your promise to me? Fan Xian didn't even bother to lift his eyes. When I'm done sleeping, I'll come and talk to you. Haitang frowned. That would be good. Fan Xian suddenly opened his eyes. I'm not in a good mood today, so I don't want to talk. Goodbye. It was the first time Haitang had seen Fan Xian so cold, but she didn't react. She simply left the room. Fan Xian lay on the large bed. He was clearly very tired, but he still could not fall asleep. His expression appeared calm, but his mind was a mess. Without enough time, he could not digest what he had heard and felt last night. He opened his bright eyes and looked at the embroidered canopy on top of the bed. His gaze seemed to pierce through the ceiling, straight through the clouds and cast into the farthest sky. Now that they had confirmed that Fan Xian was in the diplomatic mission, Northern Qi naturally wondered who had tried to rescue Xiao En from the precipice of Mount Yen. This question was naturally raised. Lang Qiao, Friar He and Xin Zhong sat on 3 chairs, their brows furrowed. Of the 3, Xin Zhong had the highest rank, but Lang Qiao was Ku He's first disciple and the young emperor's martial arts teacher, so he had the highest rank. Friar He, on the other hand, was silent. Yesterday, after the 2 of them had worked together to force Fan Xian and Xiao En off the cliff, the brocade guard had begun a secret search outside Shangjing. Unexpectedly, a day and a night had passed without any results. In the morning, when they finally couldn't resist asking for help from the palace to force their way into the diplomatic mission, they found Fan Xian sitting on the bed. Is it not Fan Xian? Friar He's pale face turned even paler. The poison on his thigh had been purged, but it had also cost him a lot of energy. Lang Qiao closed his eyes and said, That person must be Fan Xian. He is good at using poison and needles. Other than him, who else could it be? Friar He frowned. But that person looks different from Fan Xian. Lang Qiao opened his eyes and said, People can be disguised. Lang Qiao's status was special, so when he spoke, no one doubted him. But in reality, Fan Xian was perfectly fine in the diplomatic mission. If he had been the one who had fallen off the cliff, how could he have remained in one piece? Unless he was an immortal. Xin Zhong couldn't help but doubt Lang Qiao's judgment. But on the surface, he maintained the benevolent countenance of a wealthy old man. The most likely culprit is Fan Xian, because Shang Shanhu is colluding with a southerner. Only a southerner would know so much about this matter. It can't be one of the aces of Dongyi. Seeing Friar He shake his head in disagreement, Xin Zhong chuckled. Of course, it could be someone else. Other than Fan Xian, who else could it be? Lang Qiao said in a low voice. He didn't like dealing with the heads of secret agents. If it weren't for the fact that Xiao En was involved, he wouldn't have left the palace to help the brocade guard. Shen Zhong glanced at Lang Qiao. With a face full of smiles he said, Sir Lang Qiao, the Qing kingdom also has many aces. As for the problem of methods, I think you have heard that there has always been an assassin by Qin Pingping's side called the Shadow. However, no one has seen him and no one knows his methods and style of doing things. Since Fan Xian is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, then he must have some connection to the Shadow's methods. If that's the case, then the one who attacked the cliff was not Fan Xian but the Shadow. The Shadow was Qin Pingping's bodyguard. Although no one had ever seen him as the head of the Northern Qi secret agents, Shen Zhong naturally knew of his existence. It doesn't matter who it was. Friar, he sighed. The most important thing right now is to confirm whether or not Xiao En is dead. Xiao En is dead, Lang Qiao said calmly. When the black-clothed Fan Xian attacked to save Xiao En, Lang Qiao turned around and stabbed his curved knife into Xiao En's abdomen. He was very confident that the force of the knife's tip had cut off Xiao En's life in that instant. Shen Zhong smiled. That's good. The Imperial Advisor and the Empress Dowager will be very satisfied. I thank you both. Once again the sun was about to sink below the western city wall of Shangjing. Just like every day for thousands of years, the slightly hot wind swirled around the slightly withered leaves and crashed into the various houses in Shangjing. It swirled past people's bodies and swept past the silent tree trunks. After nightfall, the wind gradually cooled. Fan Xian wore an unlined robe and stood next to a tree in the rear courtyard of the diplomatic mission. His eyes narrowed as he watched the first star appear on the horizon. In this weather he didn't need to wear an unlined robe, but his body was too tired, so he was a little afraid of the cold. He carefully folded the letter in his hand. He didn't use the strength of his palms to shatter it like he usually did. Because this letter was not a secret letter from the council. It was just an ordinary letter from home. The letter was written by Wan He. Although news from home had been continuously spreading to the north, this was the first time Fan Xian had received a letter from his wife. Presumably, she had been waiting at home a little anxiously. His father-in-law, the Prime Minister, had already stepped down, and De Bao had already been brought to Fan Manor. Ruoruo was as calm as usual, as if she hadn't been disturbed by the rumors of marriage. His father was busy with court affairs. These were all the contents of the letter. At the end of the letter, there was nothing about longing, nor was there any urging of a certain person's journey. There were only a few lines. The summer night wind has stopped, and I am troubled in my dreams. I know that you will not return and my black hair grows longer. How long has it been since we parted? Thinking of you is like 3 days. Why have you come? To bury your head in your books. Thinking of you is like 3 days. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Fan Xian smiled. He could feel the faint longing in the letter and the woman's rare relaxed mood. He felt a little comforted. These days, he had been busy with many conspiracies, and inevitably his longing for the woman at home had faded. Occasionally when he thought of her he felt a little guilty. He and Haitang had arranged to meet the day after tomorrow, and for some reason he was now looking forward to this meeting. This was definitely not a problem between a man and a woman, it was just a very pure kind of hope. Fan Xian wanted to find someone to talk to. More accurately, after his conversation with Xiaoen he needed to talk, but there was no one to talk to. This strange and wonderful feeling lingered in his heart. On that rainy night in the capital of the kingdom of Qin, after the chest had been opened, Fan Xian had thought that he would no longer be lonely in this world. After all, the smell and traces of that woman were everywhere in this world. But now he truly felt that he was still lonely, because that woman had already disappeared without a trace. Xiaoen was right. I really am a heartless person, Fan Xian thought to himself. Fan Xian thought to himself that he was a man without friends. He shook his head and walked into the side room. There were only 3 people in the room: Fan Xian, Yan Bingyun, and Wang Qinian. This was the last internal meeting of the Overwatch Council in Shangjing. Yan Bingyun looked at Fan Xian calmly. Master Fan, have you gotten anything out of him? This was a situation that Fan Xian had already anticipated. He had used all the power of the Overwatch Council and Xinjiang to obtain such a clever death trap. As an official of the Kingdom of Qin, everyone was naturally eager to know what secret Xiaoen was talking about. He frowned. I acted too late. Xiaoen is dead. A strange look flashed through Yan Bingyun's eyes, but he immediately returned to normal. He shook his head and sighed. I've planned for so long but nothing has come of it. What a pity. Fan Xian smiled mockingly. The old cripple has been working for 20 years and still hasn't gotten anything out of him. Do you think I'm an immortal? In his conversations with Yan Bingyun, he would purposely refer to Qin Pingping as an old cripple. This was a very impulsive, even clumsy threat. But when dealing with someone as intelligent as Yan Bingyun, this kind of impulsive method was often more effective. He turned his head to Wang Qinian. Prepare for the return journey. Yes, sir, replied Wang Qinian in a low voice. He paused for a moment, then frowned. Master, what do we do with the impostor who was left in the room yesterday? Fan Xian knew that he meant to silence him, and he felt a little uncomfortable. Bring him back, of course. Yan Bingyun shook his head in disapproval. What if the Northern Qi people find out? What if they find out? Fan Xian stared at Yan Bingyun's face and said mockingly. Of course we'll do nothing. Even if they find out, what can they do? You've been locked up for a year and your courage has shrunk. Yan Bingyun and Wang Qinian looked at each other. They realized that Fan Xian was in a bad mood today, and so they tacitly kept their mouths shut. Fan Xian looked at the two of them and suddenly sighed. Do you think Haitang can't tell? She just can't do anything to me. Wang Qinian then asked for instructions on the return journey. Fan Xian was silent for a moment, then slowly said, Once the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet is over, we'll leave immediately. I'm a little homesick. Chapter 246. Wang Qinian accepted the order and was about to leave to make the arrangements, as well as discuss the matter with Lin Wen and Lin Jing. After all, the diplomatic mission was to bring along the noble princess. Suddenly he heard Fan Xian say, The horses we prepared on the way here, Wang Qinian, you must take care of them. Do not cause any trouble for the farmers. Yan Bingyun had not participated in the initial plan, so he did not understand. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian. Fan Xian waved his hand and he pushed open the door and left. Yan Bingyun raised his eyebrows. The three of them made 3 gestures, each with its own meaning. Fan Xian smiled. Why do you have to endure so much in front of me? Yan Bingyun did not smile. He slowly raised the teacup in front of him and took a sip. With the respect of a subordinate, he said, Since the commissioner does not want me to know, no matter how curious I am, there is no need for me to ask. Fan Xian did not think too much about it. This was only the initial plan. Since it has been abandoned, of course I have to clean it up. Then he used very simple words to explain to Yan Bingyun that when Fan Xian had just entered spring, he had found a young official of the Overwatch Council who looked similar to him in the capital. Then he had kept him in his boudoir. In the initial plan, this impersonator was supposed to play a role on the journey back from Northern Qi. He was supposed to pretend to be Fan Xian and follow the diplomatic mission south, while the real Fan Xian stayed in Shangjing to take care of matters that needed to be taken care of. You originally planned to stay in Shangjing alone? Yan Bingyun frowned. What matters were you going to take care of? Fan Xian looked at him and said, Qin Pingping wants Xiao En dead, so I plan to stay in Shangjing and kill him, then rush to the border to meet up with the diplomatic mission. That way, if Xiao En dies, the Northern Qi people won't be able to pull a fast one and slaughter our diplomatic mission. Yan Bingyun asked, You were talking to Sir Wang about the horses along the way? Fan Xian smiled and explained, Before the diplomatic mission departed from the capital, I had already asked some people in the council and some people in the palace treasury to help raise some good horses for the journey south. Of course, these horses were all secretly kept in the stable, so they wouldn't alert the Northern Qi officials. After you kill Xiao En in Shangjing, you change horses all the way and rush to the border as fast as you can? Yan Bingyun sneered. Riding alone for 1,000 miles? Is there a problem? Yan Bingyun sighed. This is the real world, not a novel. If we had followed the original plan and you killed Xiao En, Northern Qi would have closed Shangjing, and the armies of the various provinces would have sealed off the roads leading south. How could you have gotten back south on your own? Fan Xian smiled and said, Back then Qin Pingping was able to bring so many people back to the south. Why can't I do it alone? You might have been brave, but the plan was stupid. Yan Bingyun shook his head. You are the commissioner of the council and you should value your life. And in this plan, even if Northern Qi relaxed their guard because of the diplomatic mission's departure, you couldn't have assassinated Xiao En in Shangjing, where there were so many hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Fan Xian naturally wouldn't tell this man about the anti-sniper rifle. After all, Wu Zhu was missing, the chest was missing, the eldest princess was in cahoots with Shang Shanhu, and little Xian had reaped the rewards. Things had changed again and again, and the plan had become what it was now. Tomorrow was the day after tomorrow. Of course this was nonsense. Shangjing's beautiful Yuchuan River was lush with green trees. Occasionally, egrets flew up from the north. This was already upstream of the river, close to the royal palace, so it was strictly guarded. The common people of Shangjing had no way to set foot on these cobblestone paths. Fan Xian and Haitang walked side by side on the riverbank, talking nonsense here and there. He didn't feel depressed, and his mood, which had been gloomy for the past few days, seemed to have improved greatly in the company of the village girl. Strangely enough, Haitang wasn't very pretty, and her grace wasn't very charming. She had the air of a village girl, but this feeling made Fan Xian feel at ease. After a few words of nonsense, the conversation immediately turned to business. Haitang frowned slightly. The Empress Dowager still hasn't relented. Can you think of any way? Fan Xian sighed. Your emperor wants to marry a wife, and yet he wants my help. He suddenly looked at Haitang, his calm eyes containing a trace of displeasure. Since you are Sea Lily's good friend, of course you know some things. Don't you think that asking for my help would make her feel uncomfortable? Haitang's hands were in her pockets, and her feet were dragging on the bluestone ground by the riverbank. Her eyes were calm as she looked at the drooping willow tree in front of them. If you could do what Sea Lily wanted, then she wouldn't have come to Shangjing. Since you are a heartless person, why be so pretentious? I think her entering the palace is something you want to see. After all, from now on, even if you are far away in the south, you will have someone to talk to in the palace of Northern Qi. Fan Xian had never expected her to tell him everything so thoroughly, not giving him a chance to hide anything. His heart trembled and he was a little embarrassed. He felt as if the thin layer of clothing on his body had been stripped off, revealing the selfishness and heartless beneath. After a moment of silence, he smiled bitterly. I'm only an official. I don't have enough power to change everything. So you tacitly allowed this to happen. Haitang's tone wasn't aggressive, but there was an inexplicable sense of oppression in her open and above-board manner. If that's the case, there's no need to say more. Fan Xian shook his head. Once she enters the palace, her hair will turn white. You and Sea Lily are sisters. How could you bear to see her enter the palace? His Majesty is a good man. Haitang smiled. And Lily is a citizen of Qing. If she wants to live in Shangjing, it seems that only the palace can shelter her from the wind and rain. Suddenly, Haitang turned her head, and Fan Xian saw a spirit in her eyes that was even brighter than the light of the lake. In Fan Xian's life, the brightest eyes were Yi Ling-er and Haitang, but Yi Ling-er's eyes were bright and innocent, and Haitang's eyes were bright and full of understanding and indifference after seeing through the affairs of the world. Master Fan, don't you find it tiring to live a life of scheming and scheming all day long? Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. After a moment, he resolutely raised his head and put his hands behind his back. His upper body didn't move, but his lower body moved slightly. Like Haitang, he swayed on the bluestone path by the river. He spoke abruptly. In this world, not everyone can be as free and unfettered as you, because each of us has our own goals. Perhaps you just want to grow a few good vegetables and take care of the fields. But I have to think for myself, for the people around me, for the present and for the future. Having said this, he took out a letter and handed it to Haitang. I'm not a man of great wisdom. At most, I'm a little clever. Take a look and see if this method works. Haitang opened the letter and read it carefully in the daylight. After a long silence, she took a deep breath and looked at Fan Xian with her bright eyes. There was a strange look in them. Will the Empress Dowager believe me? If the Empress Dowager doesn't want to fall out with the Emperor because of this, then all she needs is face and a way out. Whether she believes me or not, these two things will be convincing enough. Fan Xian's plan was actually very simple. In the history of that world, he remembered clearly how Emperor Wu of Han had been hooked by Lady Go Yi. At that time, Emperor Wu was patrolling Hejian. Suddenly, a magician claimed that there were auspicious clouds there, indicating that there must be an extraordinary woman living there. After hearing this, Emperor Wu immediately ordered a search, and indeed, the beautiful girl was found. However, although she was beautiful, she had been ill since childhood. She rarely ate and her hands were clenched into fists. No one could make her stretch them. Emperor Wu was captivated by her beauty and personally tried to bend her fists. Then a miracle happened. Her hands easily recovered to their healthy state. Even stranger was that in her right hand, there was still a small jade hook tightly clenched. Emperor Wu was very happy. He immediately brought her into the palace and gave her the title of Lady Fist. Later she became Lady Go Yi. Who is this emperor you're talking about? Haitang asked. Fan Xian smiled. It's a story I made up. He paused and said, of course it's fake. Emperor Wu of Han is not an idiot. Maybe he came up with this. Haitang was a little naive when it came to matters between men and women. She hesitantly asked, "Then what should we do?" Fan Xian shook his head in annoyance. "Who are you?" he asked. Haitang subconsciously fell into silence. Fan Xian was startled. He wondered if this girl who wanted to study the way of heaven had been dragged into a philosophical problem. He quickly coughed and said, "You are Ku He's disciple and Ku He is the imperial advisor." If Ku He said that there were auspicious clouds in the west of the capital, and that there was an extraordinary woman beneath them, it would be much more convincing. Haitang smiled bitterly. "Why would master play along with me?" Fan Xian snorted in his heart. "Your master dared to eat human flesh and has always doted on you. It's not too much to play along with you." Haitang continued to ask, "But, everyone in Shangjing knows Lily's identity. It's impossible to hide it." Fan Xian smiled. "Take Miss C to the Temple of Qi for a few months. It would be best if she could become a nun." "What does that mean?" "She worships the temple wholeheartedly and does not think of marriage." "And then?" "When the matter has died down, she will be sent to the palace. What is done cannot be undone. She will be carved into a ship." "That's it?" "There are some details in the letter. Pay attention. Of course, if you can convince the imperial advisor to take Miss C as a disciple, that would be even better." "Master Fan, these suggestions seem absurd and ridiculous, but if you look at them carefully they are indeed feasible." Haitang bowed slightly and thanked Fan Xian. Fan Xian couldn't help but smile. This was the successful experience of Wu Zetian and Yang Guifei from his previous life. Of course it was feasible. Of course it was feasible. But there was still a big question in his heart. Why did the emperor want Si Lily to enter the palace? Why did the empress dowager not allow her to enter the palace? Haitang must know the secret, but she certainly would not tell it to an official from another court. Suddenly Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. He thought of the young emperor's demeanor when he entered the palace a few times. He couldn't help but have an extremely absurd and daring idea. Chapter 247. Naturally, Fan Xian would not tell the girl beside him what he was thinking. He just unconsciously sucked in a breath of cold air as if he had a toothache. Haitang glanced at him and said nothing. She continued to walk along the Yuchuan River. After walking for a short while, she came to the outskirts of a small garden. The bamboo fence was the door, the well was at the side of the courtyard, and the stone table was under the shade of the west. Yellow, mottled chicks were silently making a fortune from rice. This was, of course, where Haitang grew vegetables. Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. People can't be compared to each other. To be honest, Miss has always put on an act of being close to nature, but compared to the stinking pigsty in the village, this elegant place, only now do I know that planting vegetables and raising chickens also need to pay attention to the realm. These words were clear praise, but they were actually derogatory. Haitang only smiled and said, "Do you think I'm happy to stay in Shangjing? But my teacher has orders and the palace has a request, so I can only ask for a quiet garden nearby." Fan Xian laughed. "I'm afraid that Shen Zhong and the others plotted this garden for you to grow vegetables. What kind of good people and rich gentry did they harm?" Haitang said, "That is what I do not know and cannot control." She spoke indifferently and Fan Xian also listened indifferently. This was one of the things he admired about Haitang. As a transcendent figure in northern Qi, she did not forcefully pretend to be a fairy. She was not sour, not impatient, not deliberately indifferent. She just followed her heart, which was good. Before the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet, there was a rare moment of leisure. Fan Xian temporarily cast aside the gloomy mood of these days. He rolled up his sleeves and rolled up his trousers. He took out some tools from behind the grindstone and began to help Haitang turn the soil. After the delicate yellow soil was turned, he scooped up a bowl of millet. Like a greedy dragon king, he stingily scattered it on the ground bit by bit, making the chicks squeak and follow his footsteps as they ran around the little courtyard. Haitang crouched down to tidy up the branches and leaves of the fruits. She smiled as she watched Fan Xian play. Her gaze would occasionally land on his left leg. Halfway through, Fan Xian was tired and a little hot. He picked up a bucket of water from the well and stuck his head in to drink a few mouthfuls. Just as he was about to touch the surface of the water, he glanced at Haitang out of the corner of his eye. He found that the girl was very skilled at tending to the vegetable beds. She must have done this often these past few years. Fan Xian had never done farming since he was in Danzhou. Holding a hoe in his hand was not as comfortable as holding a dagger. When he was watering, it was not as refreshing as it was when he sprinkled poison. Clumsily, in the end, he was reduced to a spectator. Even so, he was so tired that his forehead was covered in sweat, and steam rose from his head. As the sun rose higher into the sky, Haitang moved 2 reclining chairs and placed them under the trellis. Hanging on the trellis was some kind of melon or fruit. The leaves were huge and glossy green, blocking out all the sunlight. Fan Xian let out a breath of hot air and sat down on the reclining chair. He bluntly accepted the herbal tea Haitang handed him, drank a few mouthfuls and then fell back down, causing the chair to creak. He closed his eyes and began to take an afternoon nap, relaxing as if he were in his own home. Haitang looked at him and smiled. She pulled off the flower scarf on her head and wiped the sweat from her forehead, then lay down as well. 2 bamboo chairs and a green canopy, a cool breeze and 2 idle people. After some time, Haitang suddenly broke the silence. You really are a strange person. You're also a strange person. Fan Xian's eyes were still closed. At least, up until now, I have not been able to see through you. As the 2 spoke, they had already dropped the honorifics of Sir Fan and Sir. Haitang felt a little more comfortable. She smiled. Why must you see through someone? And what do you mean by see through? Everyone does certain things for a certain purpose. A smile rose to the corner of Fan Xian's mouth. And I do not know what your purpose is. My purpose. Haitang fanned herself with the flower scarf. Why must one live with a purpose? Fan Xian closed his eyes. He stretched out a finger and shook it. Living is not about having a purpose. Everything we do, everything we want to achieve, is for the sake of living. Haitang said, I'm not used to talking in circles like this. I'm just talking nonsense, that's all. Fan Xian stretched. I really like talking nonsense with you. It's a feeling that allows me to convince myself that I am indeed living, and not being controlled by the purpose of living. Haitang spat. You're still talking nonsense. I just like your way of doing things. After saying this, Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. People like you and I who have no friends always want to find someone to talk to. Sir Fan, your talent is unparalleled and your name is world-shaking. How can you not have friends? For some reason, Haitang returned to calling him Sir. Fan Xian fell silent. After a while he said, I truly have no friends. And you are a proud son of Northern Qi. You and I are in opposing camps, but I feel that I can treat you as a friend. After all, when I was in Northern Qi you couldn't have killed me. Haitang glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. This official from the south was so pretty that he was indeed a bit of a bastard. Sir, you are of noble birth. After entering the capital you have flourished. Your life has been straightforward, your career unhindered. The monarchs of both countries value you. What is there to be dissatisfied with? Lonely. Lonely. Fan Xian didn't seem to think that these 2 words were a bit pretentious and nauseating. Haitang laughed. Sir Fan, you have someone as powerful as Yan Bingyun under your command. In the south, you are a powerful official of the Overwatch Council. You have a beautiful wife, and your sister is a famous talented woman. Your father is in a high position, and the people you associate with are all outstanding. How can you be lonely? A father is a father, a wife is a wife, and a sister is a sister. Yan Bingyun is a subordinate, and the people I associate with all have conflicts of interest. Fan Xian didn't know why he was so magnanimous in front of Haitang. You can think of me as pretending to be lonely or pretending to be desperate. In any case, my position as an official is not easy and my son is not happy either. Haitang's eyes were as bright as the sky. Sir Fan, could it be that you want to be friends with me? Let's not talk about friends for now, Fan Xian said. At least staying with you is more relaxing. This is an enjoyment that is hard to come by for me. What if I have other plans for you? You won't, Fan Xian replied with great confidence. Sir, you seem to have forgotten that there is enmity between us. It doesn't matter. At least right now, if someone wants to kill me, you will certainly help me. Fan Xian's long-hidden weariness finally revealed some of it. Sir Fan, I've always been curious. Why? Why were you willing to come to Northern Qi? Haitang looked at him with a smile. Actually, the affairs of the southern officialdom were no secret in the north. Of course, she knew about the mysteries and the relationship between the emperor's family. Fan Xian laughed. I'm not telling you. Haitang was speechless. Fan Xian turned over and got off the deck chair. He stretched. I'm hungry. Haitang replied, there is rice in the house, water in the well, and vegetables in the garden. You can make it yourself. Fan Xian sighed. When a man says to any woman other than his wife that he is hungry, he is usually saying that the liquor bug in his stomach is hungry. The most luxurious, quiet and well-organized restaurant in Shangjing was the Centenary Pine House. Today an honored guest had arrived. This guest was quite expensive, so the owner of the Centenary Pine House personally waited outside. He respectfully asked all the guests to leave, leaving behind a spacious and quiet 3-story building. The owner of the restaurant was naturally surprised, but the owner did not explain. He was also a high-ranking person with informants in the court. He had long seen through the identity of the man and woman. The man was the immortal poet of the southern court, and the woman was the emperor's aunt. The two of them together were characters who could take a stroll on the stone streets of the palace, let alone a restaurant. In a private room facing the street, Fan Xian squinted at the scenery as he poured wine into his mouth. After drinking 3 cups, he frowned and called for the owner to come in for a change. The owner saw that his complexion was not good, and immediately gave up on the idea of asking for the immortal poet's calligraphy. He went to Northern Qi's most famous green rice. Fan Xian took a sip and nodded. Haitang was a little annoyed. Before, it was Wuliangye the best liquor in the world. Is Master Fan not satisfied? I do like to drink strong liquor. Fan Xian turned his head to look at her. His expression was a little strange. But right now, I don't want to drink Wuliangye because there's something else about it. I can't relax too much. Wuliangye had the taste of Qingyu Hall, the taste of Yi and the taste of Fan Xian. He didn't like it today. Haitang fell silent again. She just watched Fan Xian drink. Her eyes grew brighter and brighter as if she was enjoying something very interesting. As he got tipsy, Fan Xian's eyes became a little hazy, and his smile became more relaxed. Don't you think I've lived a happy life, and yet I'm pretending to drown my sorrows in wine? Is that funny? Young people don't know the taste of sorrow. Fan Xian tapped his chopsticks on the bowl and sang. This was the first poem he had copied since his reincarnation. Now that he thought back to the past, he felt even more complicated. He sang softly again. Stay in Qing, suddenly meet my benefactor. Fortunately, mother, accumulated a shady merit. Advise life, help the needy and help the poor. Don't be like my evil uncle and treacherous brother, who love money and forget his own flesh and blood. It is multiplication, division, addition and subtraction, above the firmament. This was the verdict of Sister Qiao in Dream of the Red Chamber. Leave Yu Qing. Haitang's eyes shone even brighter. Fan Xian let out a long sigh. He raised his cup and drained it in one gulp. Miss Haitang, don't mind me. Just let me get drunk. Why should I get drunk? There were many reasons why a man wanted to drink. The most adequate reason was that he was depressed and under pressure. On this trip to Northern Qi, Fan Xian had obtained the secret of the temple, forged the friendship between the two countries, and successfully gathered the spy network in the north. No matter how one looked at it, it was a beautiful spring day. Why was he so gloomy? Where did that pressure come from? It was actually very simple. He was gloomy because he had nowhere to go. Fan Xian had told Xiao En in the cave that he was a passerby in this world, and so he had always viewed this world as a tourist. Even after 18 years of ups and downs, he still felt somewhat estranged from this world. If there was no Wanner, if there was no sister, if there was no Wu Zhu, Fan Xian would have wanted nothing more than to be free and go to the world to enjoy himself. The pressure came from the conversation in the cave. Qin Pingping had made Fan Xian set his sights higher, even higher than the world. After Fan Xian found out where the temple was, he began to understand. He began to bear this pressure alone. And this secret, which concerned the world, had squeezed Xiaoan for decades. Who knew how long it would continue to squeeze Fan Xian? If he went to the temple, of course he would die 100 times and survive. What about the people he wanted to protect? If he did not go, he would never know what had happened in the past. Fan Xian was very angry. Before he knew, he wanted nothing more than to dig Xiaoan's head open. Now that he knew, he wished he never knew. Originally, for the sake of safety, he should have returned to the capital and enjoyed a few years of glory in the officialdom and the business world, and buried the matter of the temple forever in his heart. But he was always somewhat unwilling, so he somewhat hated himself for thinking so much about Yi Qingmei, and the mother of this body. So he did not want to drink the 5-grain liquor. He even looked at the glass in his hand and felt the urge to throw it to the ground and shatter it. The verdict given to Qiao Jie in Dream of the Red Chamber really seemed to be written for him. Fortunately, he had been reborn, fortunately, he had met his benefactor, fortunately, he had his mother who had accumulated a shady skill, allowing him to easily and effortlessly obtain a large sum of wealth and the help of a large group of powerful people. What should he do in the remaining years of his life? Haitang's bright eyes seemed to be able to see through a person's heart. She slowly said, "Advise life, help the needy and comfort the poor." Fan Xian was startled awake. Although he knew that even if he was dead drunk, he could not reveal his secrets in front of anyone, but why would Haitang say this? In truth, Haitang had only said this by chance. She looked at Fan Xian's slightly deranged expression and thought of the legendary banquet in the palace of the Southern Dynasty, when the immortal of poetry first appeared in the world. She thought that Fan Xian's path of life had been set, and endless prosperity had come along the way, but he had developed a world-weary and decadent heart. This kind of situation was very common in scholars, so Haitang had said this quietly purely from the bottom of her heart. She wanted to advise Fan Xian to wholeheartedly serve the people of the world, because Haitang had always believed that Fan Xian was, in his bones, a scholar. "The world is bustling with activity, all for the sake of profit," Fan Xian said mockingly. "Miss Haitang cultivates the way of the gods. Those who seek profit do not necessarily lack righteousness. Righteousness is great profit. As long as the goal is correct, why care about the means?" After saying this, Fan Xian was stunned. This small talk was meant to divert the topic, but it had inadvertently touched upon his own heart. It was like a ray of light had suddenly struck his heart, and he immediately understood what his true feelings were. A heartless person? Perhaps he was a sentimental person at heart. All his life he had always said that he wanted to live well, but he never knew how to live well. Today he finally had a chance. At this moment, his heart was sober, but his eyes were strong with alcohol. He stared at Haitang and slowly said 2 words. "Thank you." Haitang was at a complete disadvantage in terms of words today, but it was not like he shy ran. Hearing the word "thank you," she felt a little lost in her heart. Looking at the determination in Fan Xian's drunken eyes, she suddenly felt a little uneasy. She thought for a moment and her eyes became clearer. "Given your talent, the South will be a good stage in the future. Since you do not wish to fight, you are my friend. I hope that when you rise to the 1,000 mountains, you will be careful and think of the people. Do not have the slightest complacency. This is the right path." Fan Xian gently placed his wine cup on the table and said quietly, "Don't worry, I have just started." Other than Ku He, Haitang was the #1 ace in Northern Qi. With such a beautiful woman guarding him, all of the hesitation in his heart was dispelled. Fan Xian drank to his heart's content. Although he was a bit childish and refused to drink Wuliangye, he had drunk too much green rice. In the end, his throat was dry and spicy, his chest swelled, and his mind was muddled. He floated back to his senses and happily collapsed on the table. This was the first time since Fan Xian had opened the chest that he had become so drunk that he had lost consciousness. It was in a restaurant in the enemy country of Shangjing, and in front of Haitang, who he did not know was friend or foe. Acting like this was really old-fashioned and stupid. "You really are a person who cannot be seen through." Haitang looked at Fan Xian, who had collapsed on the table and was sleeping sweetly like a child. She smiled. "I have always wanted to see Sir Shuiqin." Chapter 248. Fan Xian's head hurt a little. A pair of warm and soft hands reached out and gently rubbed his temples. He was slightly startled, but his eyes were still closed as he asked, "Where is this place?" Perhaps it was because he had drunk too much, but his voice sounded dry. He felt the hands on his temples leave his hands, and a moment later, a cup was carefully brought to his lips. He tasted it and found it was honey of the right thickness, perfect for dispelling alcohol. He couldn't help but smile. He believed that Haitang wouldn't poison him because that wouldn't do her any good. Just as he was thinking about this, he suddenly smelled a faint fragrance around him. This fragrance was extremely elegant, but it caused ripples in his heart. A wave of heat rose from his lower abdomen, directly messing up his mind. The fragrance drew closer, softly resting against the back of his head. The enchanting collision of bodies made the fire in Fan Xian's heart unbearable. Fan Xian abruptly opened his eyes. There was a lingering desire in the serenity in his eyes. Looking at the pair of white jade wrists in front of him and the light green sleeves, he said, "Lily?" Lily turned around. Her body went limp and she fell into his arms. Her eyes gazed at him weakly. There was a glimmer of hope, and a trace of hidden bitterness. The two of them had been traveling north, and the only thing they hadn't broken through was that layer of paper. Fan Xian smelled the familiar scent of a woman, and he couldn't help but be absent-minded. After he came to Shangjing, he had only seen her once in the temple. He had already decided not to have too much of a relationship with this woman. But now that when you had thrown herself into his arms, that familiar and soft touch kept rubbing against his chest and abdomen. He had just been drinking with Haitang, and now he was being intimate with Sea Lily. Of course, Fan Xian understood what was going on, but he didn't quite understand. It's not that I don't understand, but the world changes quickly. In the early summer of Shangjing, when there was no wind, it would be hot and stuffy. When there was no rain, there would be dust. It really couldn't be called a good time. Fortunately, it was already late. A light night breeze swept past, freeing the little temple from the scorching heat of the day. Sparse branches hung from the eaves of the temple, and a large, round moon was reflected in the distant but also very close background of the night sky. Fan Xian fastened his belt and ran out of the room like a perverted thief. His handsome face was filled with disbelief and absurdity. At the entrance of the temple, he suddenly turned around and looked at the woman sitting on the full moon on top of the temple. He cursed, "You're the same as your master, you're both crazy." Fan Xian had always liked to disguise himself. He was shy, sweet, and naive. Although no one believed him, he was still pure. But today he had encountered of such absurdity. He was shocked and angry, and he finally opened his mouth to curse. Haitang squatted on the roof like a nanny watching over children in love. She did not tie the floral scarf on her head but around her neck. She looked like a captain from another world. She did not seem to think that Fan Xian would wake up so quickly. Her face was full of surprise, but a faint shyness and a smile flashed through her eyes. A moment later she said quietly, "So fast." After Fan Xian's anger, he was immediately dumbfounded. What kind of woman was she? Haitang seemed to immediately understand. She patted her head with some self-blame. "How could I forget that you are Fei Jie's disciple? If I had known earlier, I would have increased the dosage when I drugged you." The moonlight moved slightly, and the sparse branches trembled. Haitang floated down without stirring up a speck of dust. She landed lightly by Fan Xian's side. She turned her head and looked at the inner room with a smile. She pushed open the temple door and signaled for Fan Xian to go out with her. Outside the temple, it was completely dark. In the distance, frogs croaked from the pond. It was a farmhouse atmosphere, but Fan Xian's heart was filled with resentment. He coldly asked, "What drug did you give me?" "Aphrodisiac," Haitang said matter-of-factly. "The best kind in the palace." Fan Xian stretched out his index finger and pointed at her nose, which was straighter than most women's. He felt the urge to smash her nose. "I am an envoy of the kingdom of Qing. She will soon be your emperor's woman. How dare you?" Haitang's face immediately grew cold. "Master Fan, when you drugged me by wudu, why didn't you feel like you were a coward? Then we were enemies. Today we are friends. How could that be?" Fan Xian immediately seemed less confident. Haitang smiled. "When we were in the palace, what did you say?" "Many days ago in the palace. The antidote you gave me last time was too much orange peel. It was a bit bitter." Haitang was intoxicated by the sunlight. Fan Xian smiled. He knew that she had seen through his tricks that day. He said quietly, "I am the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. I am not a sage who seeks the way of heaven. It is normal for me to use some tricks. I hope you do not mind. Of course, if you do mind, you can also give me that drug." These words were a bit frivolous, but Haitang did not blush like other women. She said lightly, "If there is a chance, I will naturally use it. If there is a chance, I will naturally use it. If there is a chance, I will naturally use it." Fan Xian, with his amazing memory, of course remembered this sentence clearly. He did not expect that as a woman she would actually use it. He could not help but snort coldly. He was angry, but there was nothing he could do. He had let someone else drug him, and someone else had drugged him at his request. It seemed that there was nothing he could say. And so, Fan Xian raised his head to look at the moon, and lowered his head to hate the woman. "I am not a sage. I am just a petty woman who holds a grudge." Haitang laughed. She was very much a woman. "It should not be Sea Lily. You are her sister." Fan Xian looked at Haitang coldly. "You know what this means. Lily likes you." Haitang smiled. "You do not dislike Lily, so we sisters think this is possible." Actually, after knowing that Fan Xian was the Mr. Chow who wrote Story of the Stone, Haitang was even more certain of this idea. Fan Xian suddenly fell silent, thinking of something. After a while, he suddenly looked at Haitang and said, "Actually, since you drugged me with an aphrodisiac, although you are indeed not a beauty, I can still reluctantly sacrifice myself. Why drag Missy into this?" No matter how carefree and natural she was, no matter how uninhibited she was, in the end she was still a young girl. Hearing this, she couldn't help but become angry. Her bright eyes stared fiercely at Fan Xian like a she-wolf in the middle of the night on a wasteland. Fan Xian let out a breath of resentment and immediately recovered his calm. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "I can just pat my butt and leave. Be careful of your teacher punishing you." Haitang took a deep breath and suppressed her emotions. She said calmly, "I hope you will forgive me for plotting against you today." Fan Xian said expressionlessly, "You can plot against me a few more times. No man would refuse such luck, but you can forget it." Haitang was no longer angry. She only said quietly, "The day after tomorrow, there will be a banquet in the palace. There will be a martial battle. You should prepare first, sir. After the banquet, I will leave for home." Fan Xian stared at Haitang's ordinary face. It was strangely strange. "I cannot stay in Shangjing. There are urgent matters at home. Arrange for me to meet with Miss C again." Haitang bowed slightly and silently agreed. She then watched Fan Xian's figure gradually disappear into the darkness. As he passed by a ridge, Fan Xian stumbled slightly and almost fell. Perhaps it was because he was uneasy, but seeing his hands fumble in his robe, she realized that his belt had not been fastened properly. The immortal of poetry of a generation, the future minister of a generation, the most embarrassing scene of his life, happened inside and outside the most remote temple in Shangjing. Haitang smiled. Her bright eyes were full of joy. No one knew why she was so happy. Returning to the diplomatic mission, Fan Xian's eyes were serene. He did not look the least bit embarrassed, nor did he show the anger he had earlier. Living in this world, it was difficult to avoid being schemed against by others, unless you were a perfect person who could see through the hearts of others. He did not expect Haitang to have such a reckless side. He also did not expect her to act so boldly and decisively. This kind of gambler was not much different from his own. Only 4 in total? He had already taken a bath and was half leaning on a chair. But he still smelled a faint fragrance on his body. He could not help but think of that girl, and a faint feeling welled up in his heart. Even though he was a cold and hard person, he could not help but narrow his eyes. He began to calculate how this matter would affect that girl. Perhaps what Haitang said was true, but what of it? Yan Bingyun frowned and looked at him. Fan Xian was his superior, the official commander of the diplomatic mission. Just as the diplomatic mission was about to leave the kingdom of Qi, he had disappeared without a trace for an entire day. There were many things he could not ask for instructions on. Although the news in the afternoon confirmed that he was having a drinking contest with Haitang, who rarely appeared in front of people, where did he go? Why did Master Fan look so strange today? Yes. In 4 years, only 4 concubines entered the palace, Yan Bingyun replied. The Northern Qi Emperor has practiced the way of the heavens since he was a child. Looking at his style of governance, he can be considered a wise ruler. Anyone with great ambitions would naturally not be interested in the affairs of men and women. The Northern Qi Emperor should not have any children yet, right? Fan Xian asked with his eyes closed. The Emperor is still young and the palace is not in a hurry. Not in a hurry? Forget it. Go and have Wang Qinian make arrangements for the palace entry the day after tomorrow, as well as the return trip. Fan Xian snorted in his heart and waved his hand for Yan Bingyun to leave. Yan Bingyun looked at him with some confusion. He knew that the commissioner had many secrets that he had not revealed. It was true that although Fan Xian was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, there were many things he would not tell anyone. For example, tonight's matter, or the possibility of the Northern Qi Emperor being attacked. Fan Xian's fingers were still cold. Only now did he realize that he was not as brave as Haitang. The main gates of the palace slowly opened. The beautiful palace, hidden in the green mountains with its black eaves and flowing waterfalls, once again appeared in front of everyone. Fan Xian looked coldly at the unfamiliar Northern Qi officials and calmly walked into the palace. He then greeted Wei Hua and the other officials from the office of the Grand Herald, who he was familiar with, and was politely invited into the Great Hall by a eunuch. The Great Hall was quiet. The clear water beside the long imperial path was calm and unruffled, and the fish in the water swam naturally. The Empress Dowager and the Emperor sat high up on the imperial platform. Below them were a dozen or so tables. The people sitting there were all high-ranking officials of Northern Qi. Ordinary officials only had the right to eat in a side hall. As the head envoy of Qing, Fan Xian sat high up on the first table to the left. Other than Gao De, who was standing steadily behind him, the only other people in the diplomatic mission were Lin Wen and Lin Jing. Sitting opposite the diplomatic mission were the Grand Tutor and the Prime Minister of Northern Qi. Fan Xian glanced at the Grand Tutor. He knew that he was Zhuang Mohan's most famous student. He had not expected him to be so young. After a series of formalities, the birthday banquet finally began. The Empress Dowager of Northern Qi was actually still very young. Although there were some wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, she still had the pure beauty of a noble woman. But Fan Xian knew from the matter with Xiao En that this woman was actually an extremely cruel and merciless person. Thinking of Xiao En, he subconsciously tilted his head. Shang Shan, who was sitting at the table next to him. It was a pity that when he entered the hall, he had not had the opportunity to clearly see the elegance of the foremost general of Northern Qi. The Empress Dowager raised her wine cup and said something. Her voice was very soft and clear. Fan Xian did not pay attention. He just followed the officials in bowing and reciting the words of praise. The Empress Dowager's birthday was a red bomb that the common people could not compare to. The officials of Northern Qi wanted nothing more than to plunder all the precious objects in the world and move them to the palace. The green dragon jade on Dong Mountain, the marvelous bell imported from Dongyi, the rare two-tailed ferret from the snowy lands of the north. The Empress Dowager nodded slightly, seeming quite satisfied. The gifts from the Qing diplomatic mission had long been transported from the capital. Although they were expensive, they were not extraordinary. Naturally, Fan Xian would not actually compose a poem for the Empress Dowager. Otherwise, before the Empress Dowager's face hit the ground, his face would hit the ground first. Furthermore, his calligraphy would not be presentable. His personal birthday gift was a small bottle. Inside the bottle was a clear amber liquid. It looked ordinary, but after the Empress Dowager opened the lid and took a whiff, the look in her eyes when she looked at Fan Xian was not quite right. It was one of admiration and love. Yes, it was a very uncreative perfume. The palace treasury had stopped producing it for 15 years, and Fan Xian had stolen it from Qingyu Hall. He had originally planned to use it to intoxicate Haitang. But he had not expected Haitang to not be into it. He had not expected that Haitang was not a great beauty. When Fan Xian had been preparing Li Qingzhao's poem in the capital, The Water of France, he had not expected that he would not be able to subdue Haitang through the issue of men and women. Instead, he had almost been tricked by her. After Fan Xian thanked the Empress Dowager, he raised his eyes and glanced at the emperor. Unexpectedly, he found that the young emperor was also looking at him with a smile. He had long been prejudiced against him. Seeing the emperor's liking gaze, he could not help but feel his hair stand on end. Chapter 249. Fan Xian's heart trembled, but his face remained respectful. He lowered his eyes, avoiding the young emperor's gaze, but he was too embarrassed to look at the Empress Dowager. The old faces of the Grand Tutor and the Prime Minister were meaningless, so his gaze naturally fell on the table next to the Grand Tutor. That table was empty. He didn't know which official had not arrived yet. Just as she was thinking, a person walked out from behind a pillar by the Chang Palace pool. He bowed to the Empress Dowager and the Emperor in the hall, and then very naturally sat down at that table. A palace maid had already gone to pour wine. This man was dressed in black. He was tall and slender, full of power. His eyes were as calm as an ancient well, bottomless. The strangest thing was that he wore a chain around his waist. He carried 2 curved knives with him as he entered the hall. This man was quite daring. Fan Xian sucked in a breath of cold air. He tilted his head and asked Lin Jing, "Who is this?" To be able to sit next to the Grand Tutor and bring knives into the palace, he must be an incredible person. Lin Jing quietly introduced him. This is Imperial Advisor Ku He's first disciple, Sir Lang Tiao. He is the commander of the Imperial Guards in the palace, but I've heard that in recent years he has mainly been in charge of the Emperor's martial cultivation. He doesn't really manage affairs. Fan Xian made an "oh" sound as if he had just understood. With a hint of shock, he said, "So this is Miss Haitang's senior disciple. No wonder he has such a high status." At this moment, Lang Tiao's calm gaze had already landed on Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian smiled and raised the wine cup in his hand in a friendly gesture. He gestured to Lang Tiao, his lips slightly parted, and soundlessly said 2 words, "Hello." Lang Tiao frowned. No one knew what he was thinking. After a moment's hesitation, he finally raised the cup in his hand and drank with Fan Xian from a distance. Lin Jing quietly said to Fan Xian, "Sir, this man really should be on good terms with you. It's a pity that you have to leave for home the day after tomorrow. This is your first time meeting him." Fan Xian put on a look of pity, but in his heart, he was wondering if Lang Tiao would recognize him. As he pondered this, Lang Tiao was also puzzled. The expression of the young official of the kingdom of Qin was so natural, and did not seem to be fake at all. Could it be that Xinzhong had guessed correctly? That the black-clothed man on the cliff was Qin Pingping's shadow guard, and not Commissioner Fan? Fan Xian's heart was calm. He swept his gaze over all the tables in the hall and asked, "Why don't I see Master Xin?" Lin Jing replied, "Although Xinzhong is the provost of the Discipline Commission, his rank is not high enough to enter the imperial palace. Moreover, today is the Empress Dowager's birthday, so he must be in charge of all matters in Shangjing." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything more. After a while, the ceremonial music in the palace gradually began. The sound of bamboo and string instruments played a magnificent feeling. There were dancers dancing in the hall. Clear light appeared on the ceiling. The birthday banquet officially began. First, the emperor raised his cup to the Empress Dowager and congratulated her on her birthday. Then the officials below him knelt in order to wish her well. Fan Xian, as a foreign official, sat at the head of the table, and with Lin Jing at his side, secretly reminded him what to do. He passed this stage smoothly. Wine, fruits and vegetables were brought to the hands of beautiful palace maids, quietly and gracefully placed on each table. Every time a palace maid came to serve him, Fan Xian would always turn slightly and smile in acknowledgement. In the eyes of the Northern Qi officials, this was unavoidably a bit artificial, but there were also those who liked him more and more, feeling that this outstanding figure of the younger generation was indeed extraordinary. Fan Xian, on the other hand, looked at the soft eyebrows of the palace maids, and felt very uneasy. The young emperor spent every day with these beautiful girls, and yet he had not become a licentious youth. There was indeed something wrong with this. Although the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet was not an ordinary old lady's birthday, there was not much of a difference. It was just that the guests were of a higher class, and the wine and dishes were of a higher level. Naturally, the after-dinner entertainment was also a bit of a headache. This was definitely not the kind of entertainment that Aunt Lee west of Erdo village on Mount Teeling would have thought of for her 50th birthday. Fan Xian rubbed his temples, a warm smile on his face, but in his heart, he had already begun to curse. Gentle girls now liked to call themselves old mothers, to be forthright. Boorish men now liked to smile shyly, to be disgusting. Pig butchers liked to eat their neighbors' vegetables, and old nannies with flowers on their heads who could not get married, liked to go around being matchmakers. People all liked to get close to the things they were least good at, and liked to do the things they were least good at. According to psychology, if you lacked something, you would unconsciously emphasize it. So, under the leadership of the emperor, the kingdom of Qin, which had always been famous for its martial arts, began to walk the road of scholarly governance. Even though there were military generals and martial experts in the capital, poetry competitions were popular. In the palace, imperial concubine Shu was fond of literature, so she was favored. The second prince was well versed in the classics and won the hearts of the people. Then, out of nowhere, the immortal poet Fan Xian appeared, immediately attracting the gazes and admiration of all scholars. Northern Qi, which had always been the center of literature, was now striving to become stronger. Poetry competitions were no longer popular, but rather preferred to play duels. Instead, they gave up on words and used fists to reason. As a result, the Qin diplomatic mission's entrance was littered with small scimitars. The number of Northern Qi experts who wanted to challenge Fan Xian could form a line from the diplomatic mission's entrance all the way to the valley of Mount Yen. Fan Xian shut himself in, and when he did, he traveled with Haitang. With great difficulty, he had avoided the tragic fate of fighting in the arena every day. Unexpectedly, before he was about to return home in this great hall, he could no longer avoid it. "Master Fan, what do you think of this proposal?" The Empress Dowager smiled and turned her gaze to the table where Fan Xian sat. Although it was a question, her tone was unquestionable. Fan Xian shivered slightly. Earlier, one of the Northern Qi generals had proposed a duel. Although it was a nice way to talk about martial arts, everyone knew that the Northern Qi officials knew that there was nothing they could do about the so-called immortal poet in literature. They were prepared to humiliate him, and for some reason the Empress Dowager seemed to dislike him. He stood up and swept his gaze across the hall. Suddenly he smiled and said, "Empress Dowager, I do not have the strength to truss a chicken. Let's forget about it." There was a roar of laughter in the hall. No one believed Fan Xian's words. The news of Fan Xian killing Qing Jushu and beating Yi Ling with a black fist had long since spread throughout the world. He was publicly recognized as a rare man who excelled in both the pen and the sword. The officials had not expected the southern envoy to be so cowardly. The Empress Dowager said calmly, "You are too modest, Master Fan. She said a few more words, not allowing Fan Xian to refuse. Fan Xian's eyelid twitched. No wonder in the transmigration novels he had read in his previous life, all the transmigrators followed Lord Wei's glorious tradition and called the Empress Dowager an old whore. If he gave in now, he would lose face for the court. When he returned to the south, it would be difficult to explain to his father and the old cripple. He did not know what kind of sinister slander would be unleashed in Xinjiang. So he smiled and took half a step back, cupping his hands in acknowledgement. The Empress Dowager's eyes brightened, but the Emperor, who sat next to her, looked worried. He asked with concern, "Minister Fan, if you are not feeling well, let's forget about it." Although Fan Xian had only chatted with the Emperor a few times, and he had long held a grudge against him, he could hear the genuine concern in his words. He thought of the fact that the Emperor was, after all, the Emperor. He could not help but feel touched. He raised his head and said in a clear voice, "Your Majesty, even if my blood splatters in front of the hall, let it be a celebration of the Empress Dowager's birthday." These words were neither fish nor fowl and greatly violated etiquette. They immediately spoiled the atmosphere, and the Empress Dowager's face darkened. The Emperor laughed, finding it very interesting. This Fan Xian was indeed gentle on the outside, but stubborn on the inside and unwilling to be taken advantage of. He waved his hand and said, "These words have gone too far. Since it is a competition, naturally it should be stopped when it is appropriate." The Emperor's eyes grew cold. He looked at the officials in the hall and said, "If anyone is unable to control the strength of their attack, then it is best that they do not come out and make a fool of themselves." These words first stopped those who were prepared to hurt him by accident. The officials felt a chill in their hearts. They realized that the speed at which this young emperor had matured over the years was astonishing. The emperor's power was growing stronger and stronger. Even stranger, why was His Majesty treating Fan Xian so well? Was this our emperor, or the emperor of the kingdom of Qing? As soon as the words were spoken, a general walked in from outside the side hall. He bowed to the Empress Dowager and the emperor. In a low voice he said, "I, Cheng Puzhu, wish to learn from Master Fan of the kingdom of Qing." The Empress Dowager nodded slightly. The emperor was aware of Cheng Puzhu's level. He was Lang Qiao's martial nephew, and could be considered a student of the Tianyi faction. He was currently serving in the Imperial Guard, and had probably heard an order from his superiors, so he had come to compete. The emperor had learned from Haitang that Fan Xian was already at the beginning of the 9th level, while Cheng Puzhu was only at the 7th level. The emperor glanced at Lang Qiao, his martial master, and found that Lang Qiao was sitting calmly in his seat, his face expressionless. Cheng Puzhu bowed to Fan Xian and said in a low voice, "Master Fan, you are a master of both the pen and the sword, and your name shakes the world. I ask for your guidance, Master Fan." Fan Xian smiled and also glanced at Lang Qiao. He knew that the competition in the palace today was not because he was competitive. Rather, it was because Lang Qiao wanted to see his fighting style before he returned home. After he had arrived in northern Qi, he had not fought in front of anyone. Lang Qiao must still have some doubts about the matter at the cliff. He cupped his hands towards Cheng Puzhu. "Lord Cheng?" Cheng Puzhu replied in a low voice, "Indeed." Fan Xian said, "You are not a match for me." He then sat down. The officials were in an uproar, thinking that Fan Xian was a bit too arrogant. Just as they were thinking this, they heard a steady voice. "I ask for your guidance, Lord Cheng." Cheng Puzhu was fuming, but then he saw the bodyguard behind Fan Xian take a step forward and stand in front of him. Sunlight shone down from the ceiling of the palace, scattering a clear light. The palace was incomparably bright, so he could clearly see the boundless murderous intent contained in the bodyguard's plain face. It was only one step. Gauda had only taken one step forward, but his entire person had changed. Before he had been an unremarkable bodyguard, hidden in Fan Xian's shadow. Now that he had taken a step forward, he seemed to have the air of a grandmaster. There was no wind in the palace, but Gauda's jinqi flowed through his body, causing his clothes to flutter slightly. Fan Xian used the cover of the table to sit on the floor, holding a small wine cup with 2 fingers. His eyes narrowed, he used his peripheral vision to observe Lang Qiao's expression. Lang Qiao seemed uninterested in what was happening. He held a pair of chopsticks in his hand, picking at the dishes on his plate. But Fan Xian's eyes were sharp and he saw Lang Qiao's chin move slightly. This was a sign of agreement. Cheng Puzhu took a deep breath. He looked at Gauda in front of him. Everyone in Shangjing knew that he was an expert bodyguard of the Southern Diplomatic Mission. He had once subdued General Tan Wu, a subordinate of General Shang Shan in one move. He was a true master. But things had come to this and Qing Puzhu could not back down. He shouted, "Your Majesty, please permit me to use my saber." Although the young emperor admired Fan Xian, he was no fool. He knew that he was the emperor of Northern Qi, and he rather admired this general's courage and power. With a look of approval he said, "Permitted. General Qing, do your best. This is purely a martial competition. Do not think of it as the face of the court. Whether you win or lose, I will reward you." The Empress Dowager looked at her son, her eyes full of disapproval. But the young emperor smiled as if he did not see his mother's gaze. The two brothers Lin Wen and Lin Jing were extremely nervous. They were about to leave for home, so how could they cause such a ruckus in the palace? If they won, Northern Qi would lose face and that would not be good. If they won, the Qing court would lose face and that would be even worse. But the officials of the kingdom of Qing had developed a natural ruthlessness over the decades. Seeing the other side's provocation, even though they were civil officials, they were truly angry. They said to Gao Da, "Guard Gao, don't go overboard. Talk of victory before the battle." Fan Xian glanced at the two deputies beside him and laughed bitterly. He thought to himself that these two were even more arrogant than him. Turning his head toward the emperor on the dragon chair, he said, "Your Majesty, please allow my subordinate to bring a knife into the palace." The emperor smiled at him and waved his hand. Outside the palace, it was known that there would be a martial competition. Today was the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet, so the palace had been lax. Furthermore, the emperor had given his approval, so the officials who had been eating in the side hall all rushed to the entrance of the palace, casting their eager gazes upon the field. A young eunuch fetched Gao Da's long saber from the palace's corner door and handed it to the eunuch in front of the palace. Fan Xian saw Wang Qinian standing at the entrance of the palace, sneakily looking in their direction. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He wondered if Wang Qinian's hands were itching to return to his old profession and search for something in the palace. Gao Da gripped the hilt of the long saber with both hands, and his entire mental state immediately entered a very strange state. The power from before was gone, and the oppressive feeling no longer existed. All that was left on the field seemed to be only one saber. Even though it was one man and one saber in the eyes of a spectator, there was still only one saber. Lang Tao put down his chopsticks and looked at the unique long saber in Gao Da's hands. He seemed to have thought of something and his brows furrowed slightly. Qing Puzhu and Gao Da stood facing each other. Looking at their opponent who was standing steadily, they cast aside all distracting thoughts. Taking a deep breath, they slowly pulled out the curved saber from its sheath. The blade scraped against the mouth of the sheath, making a hot-blooded metallic sound. Gao Da still did not move. Holding the long saber with both hands, his entire body leaned a few inches to the right. Qing Puzhu slowly circulated his jinqi, pouring it into his wrist. He felt as if his forearm had become one with the curved saber. Only then did he raise the blade slightly. He was Lang Tao's disciple nephew, and belonged to Ku He's faction. Although he was only a 7th-level martial artist, he had the self-confidence that his master had bestowed upon him. His opponent could be arrogant, but he would not. The saber flashed like snow. The distance of several feet between the two masters seemed to not exist. In a flash it disappeared. In the next moment, Qing Puzhu had already appeared in front of Gao Da. The two were very close, as if their faces were touching, and their bodies were touching. And that snow-like saber light came from Qing Puzhu's hand. The curved saber was strangely hanging upside down. He raised it high, and the tip of the saber was aimed straight for Gao Da's left shoulder. The distance between the two was too close. Even Qing Puzhu could only hang the curved saber upside down, using this treacherous and unpredictable method to stab. Furthermore, Gao Da was holding the long saber with both hands. At this moment there was no way he could unsheath it. Even if he did, there was no way he could use it at such a short distance. Qing Puzhu lived up to his reputation as an extraordinary master. In a short time he had relied on his opponent's weapon to come up with a plan to subdue him. The officials were slightly startled. It seemed that they were about to see blood spurt from Gao Da's shoulder. Fan Xian frowned slightly. It seemed that he had not expected Qing Puzhu's attack to be as swift as lightning. Crack! An extremely unpleasant sound rang out. Immediately after, there was a shattering sound, followed by another muffled sound. In the next moment, the Empress Dowager, the Emperor, and the officials watching from outside, all watched in shock as a figure was sent flying. Qing Puzhu landed heavily on the ground. His face was covered in blood. It seemed that he had suffered a grievous injury. The crowd thought that Gouda had used Jinchi to send Cheng Puzhu flying, and they couldn't help but be shocked. To send a 7th-level master flying with Jinchi, other than the 4 grandmasters, perhaps only a few 9th-level masters could do so. And Gouda was only a bodyguard of the Qin diplomatic mission. Only the martial masters present could clearly see what had happened. When Cheng Puzhu's curved saber came down, Gouda did not draw it. Instead, he held the long saber with both hands and brought it down. The hilt of the long saber was about an inch wide, and it was this small area of the hilt that met the tip of Cheng Puzhu's curved saber. The long saber in Gouda's hands was as tall as a man. As he raised the saber, the scabbard stood firmly on the ground. So when the tip of the curved saber pierced the hilt, it was as if all of Cheng Puzhu's Jinchi and power had been transferred through the long saber in Gouda's hand to the bluestone floor beneath his feet. Gouda remained uninvolved. He watched as Cheng Puzhu's attack, which he had been preparing for a long time, collided head-on with the ground. In the future, even if you were a grandmaster, so what? In that instant, Cheng Puzhu felt an extremely powerful force pass through the tip of the saber, making it hard for him to breathe. And at that moment, Gouda put down his saber and cupped his fists. His arms seemed to form a circle and he turned to the left. The steel-like tip of his right elbow struck Cheng Puzhu's chin heavily. The blow was so powerful that it knocked out his opponent's teeth and split his lips. Blood flowed freely. Gouda had been merciful, otherwise this blow would have killed Cheng Puzhu. Rather than saying that Cheng Puzhu had been defeated by Gouda, it would be better to say that he had been defeated by the earth. A eunuch had already helped Cheng Puzhu out of the room for treatment. Gouda calmly bowed to the emperor and the empress dowager, pulled out his long saber, and slowly retreated behind Fan Xian. With a crack, the bluestone floor where they had fought earlier began to crack inch by inch. Only now did the officials in the hall realize that the unsheathed long saber had been driven into the bluestone by Cheng Puzhu's curved saber. What kind of power was this? Understanding that Gouda had used a trick, the officials began to talk among themselves, but they didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at the expressions of the Northern Qi officials and smiled a little self-deprecatingly. In their eyes, this smile was a little repulsive. Fan Xian handed his cup of wine to Gouda behind him. Gouda was slightly taken aback. He took the cup and drained it in one gulp. "Thank you for the wine, sir. Thank you for your guidance." He didn't know what guidance Fan Xian had given him. Fan Xian smiled. It should be to thank the Empress Dowager for bestowing. Before he could finish, he realized that the hall had suddenly fallen silent, including the officials and eunuchs outside the hall. Because Lang Qiao had spoken. Lang Qiao smiled at Fan Xian. "Sir Fan's little tricks truly live up to their reputation. I didn't expect even your bodyguard to understand them." Having said this, he stood up and gently took off his outer robe, handing it to a palace maid behind him, revealing the 2 curved sabers at his waist. The hall buzzed. Sir Lang Qiao was about to appear. Lang Qiao was the first disciple of the imperial advisor and the emperor's martial teacher. The officials in Beijing had not seen him in action for many years. Who would have thought that he would make an exception for the people of Qin today? The officials turned their burning gazes to Lang Qiao, but because of his special status, they didn't dare say anything. Before Lang Qiao had walked out, Fan Xian had already laughed and waved his hand. "I'm no match for you." Earlier he had directly said that Cheng Puzhu was no match for him. Now he admitted that he was no match for him. In the ears of the Northern Qi people, he seemed somewhat open and aboveboard. Lang Qiao smiled. "Whether or not I'm a match we'll only know after we fight." Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that if he really did fight with this ace, first, if he didn't use his hidden crossbow, poison needles and aphrodisiac powder, then he wouldn't be able to last more than 3 rounds. Second, if Lang Qiao really did confirm that he was the man at the edge of the cliff, given Ku He's endless concealment of the temple, he would probably be hunted down. His brows furrowed tightly, but he knew that Lang Qiao had given the Qin people enough face by personally challenging them. He could not let Gouda fight again. Just as his heart was gradually hardening and he was about to act, he heard a voice. "Senior brother, let me do it." Fan Xian was happy. Very happy. The people of Northern Qi were also happy, and those watching were even happier. Haitang slowly walked out from behind the Empress Dowager and bowed slightly to Lang Qiao. "Elder brother, let me do it." Seeing that it was her, Lang Qiao's expression softened. "That's fine of course, but you have to be careful of Sir Fan's methods." Haitang bowed to the Empress Dowager and the Emperor, but didn't say anything. She walked in front of Fan Xian and smiled. "Are you coming?" Of course, why wouldn't I? The two of them didn't feel like they were talking to each other like children playing house. Of course, the people of northern Qi who had surrounded the Great Hall in 3 layers didn't notice. Even the officials of the Qing diplomatic mission didn't notice. Everyone had sunk into some kind of anticipation. This kind of anticipation had already surpassed victory and defeat, and surpassed the prestige of the two countries. They simply wanted to see what would happen in a moment. One was the immortal poet of Qing, skilled in both the pen and the sword. He had become the commissioner of the Overwatch Council at the tender age of less than 20, Fan Xian. The other was the Northern Qi goddess, the youngest superior 9th-level ace after Ku He. She was a legendary Tianmai, and was believed to be the most likely to become the 5th great grandmaster Haitang. Both of them were the most famous of the younger generation. It was rumored that the two of them had traveled around Shangjing, forgetting to return home. It seemed that they appreciated each other. This also proved that the two of them were indeed on the same level. The two of them were finally going to meet. After some time, Wang Qinian, who was standing guard at the door to the Great Hall, yawned. Looking at the young man and woman fighting in the hall, he muttered, "Who are they trying to fool?" A eunuch next to him said indignantly, "They're actually faking a fight in front of the Great Hall. Lady Haitang, how could you bear to disappoint us onlookers?" Wang Qinian said unhappily, "I didn't take your money, so naturally they weren't acting seriously. So what if it was a fake fight? Based on their status, I'm afraid even His Majesty the Emperor would be too embarrassed to expose them." Chapter 250. On the other side, Fan Xian's movements were clumsy. He held his palms horizontally and vertically, chopping back and forth like a kitchen knife. How could there be any nimbleness? Every time he struck out with his palm, there was a strong gust of wind that whistled and cut through the air. It looked overbearing, but each palm struck the air around Haitang. He had no intention of touching the girl's skin at all. He only lifted the corners of Haitang's coarse clothes. What technique was this? This was the technique Wu Bai always used when he went on stage to sing with an electric fan in front of him. This was the technique Stephen Chow threw newspaper pieces in front of the fan and unbuttoned the pajamas of the main characters. Haitang's clothes were like clouds. She smiled amidst the wind from the palms. On the long imperial platform, accompanied by water and light, she was as ethereal as a fairy. She floated as if she wanted to ride the clouds and fly away. Occasionally she would point to the east, then to the west. No one knew where she was pointing to. This was not a trick of pointing to the east or striking to the west. It was a young girl's way of commanding troops. The two of them fought like this for who knew how many rounds, but there was not the slightest hint of smoke or fire. Since they did not think of blood, their attacks were naturally light. It was like a vegetarian meal in a temple that did not even bear to use soybean oil. It was so light that it was nauseating. Even a young eunuch could see that the two masters were pretending to fight, not to mention the old foxes and young foxes in the hall. Some of the officials' eyes had long since widened. They had not expected Haitang and Fan Xian to be so thick-skinned as to not care about the face of the court at all. The Empress Dowager looked at the long platform in the hall and the two figures in the clear light. She could not help but snort coldly. Although she did not lose her composure, the fine lines at the corner of her eyes were full of hidden anger. Instead, it was the young emperor who watched Fan Xian float around in the clear light and could not help but laugh. Lang Qiao's face was calm as he watched the scene unfold. He knew that Fan Xian's seemingly clumsy attack was actually a very powerful coffin breaker. But that was a martial art passed down through the generations of the Yi family in the capital. How did this Fan kid learn it? Inside and outside the hall, the expectant crowd was finally disappointed. After watching for so long, some people could not help but yawn. The eunuch in front could not help but shake his head. Who knows how long this will last? In any case, there is no winner or loser. Wang Qinian also shook his head regretfully. I think someone is going to stop it soon. The young eunuch didn't believe it and shook his head. The officials in the hall are all shrewd people. Who would step forward? Wang Qinian started to argue with him. Finally, they got excited and started to bet on when the two people dancing on the long imperial platform would stop. Several people on the side saw that they were fighting excitedly, so they also came over and placed their own bets. 1 card of sea urchins, 2 cucumbers, and all kinds of strange bets were placed. Impudent. Finally, a minister looked at the Empress Dowager's increasingly gloomy face and couldn't bear it any longer. He slammed the table and stood up, angrily rebuking, "What are you doing at the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet? Are you trying to deceive me?" These words were not beautiful, just like a stupid child who cried out that the emperor was running around naked. No matter how ugly the world was, whoever cried out the truth first would be an extremely unlikable fellow. Just like today, even though he knew that Fan Xian and Hai Tang were playing the Chongling swordplay, he didn't cry out. The Empress Dowager could still thicken her face and watch. After all, it was her birthday today. Watching young children dance was not a big deal. But this minister's cry was deceiving the emperor. Wasn't that forcing the Empress Dowager to fly into a rage? So the Empress Dowager prepared to fly into a rage. She looked coldly at the minister, countless thoughts running through her mind. She wanted to tear his lips apart. The emperor was still smiling. In the pool, the two people on the imperial platform acted as if they hadn't heard the cheers of the audience. They acted seriously. Hai Tang floated back and forth, Fan Xian walked like a dragon or a tiger. The girl's figure was clear and beautiful, and little Fan Xian's appearance was handsome. It was really a good fight. In just a moment, they had fought from the imperial platform to the front of the palace behind it. They were only a few feet away from the dragon chair, and they stopped in front of the minister's table. Fan Xian's palm turned into a kitchen knife and chopped down viciously on the empty chopping board. He let out a cry as if he had missed. Hai Tang's posture in the air was slightly sluggish. Two fingers of her right hand stabbed out like a sword. With a swish, she was about to strike Fan Xian's chest. No one knew how the two of them changed positions, but in the next moment, the wind from their palms and fingers did not strike anyone's body. Instead, with a swish they surged forward. Behind them was the minister's seat. The minister was aghast. With Hai Tang and Fan Xian attacking at the same time, even if Imperial Advisor Ku He were here, he would still have to temporarily avoid the brunt of the attack. The short table was instantly shattered into countless pieces. The wine jug on the table cracked and the dishes fell. The smell of wine and oil filled the air, staining the minister's head and face. His brow was covered with cauliflower, his mouth was full of radish, and a few strands of golden mushrooms hung from his ears. The soup and water had washed his face. He was as miserable as one could imagine. The hall immediately quieted down. Only now did the ministers realize that Miss Hai Tang and the Southern Emperor's envoy were sometimes troublemakers. For the sake of their own reputation, it was best not to say anything more. Fan Xian and Hai Tang stopped fighting at the same time. Separated by a few steps, they looked at each other and smiled. Hai Tang bowed slightly to the Empress Dowager. Master Fan, your coffin breaker technique is impressive. My daughter did not respond properly and thus affected you. I hope the Empress Dowager will forgive me. People can make mistakes. Fan Xian's face was also full of self-blame. He waved his right hand. A horse can make a mistake. The Empress Dowager loved Hai Tang dearly and did not want to blame her. Besides, today was her birthday banquet, and making a scene to liven up the atmosphere was not bad. It was a pity that the southern envoy had not suffered. But seeing Fan Xian's self-deprecating words, the Empress Dowager could not help but smile faintly. The emperor also laughed strangely and the ministers also laughed awkwardly. Only the true masters of the martial way knew that the seemingly joking fight actually contained some of the thoughts of the two young masters. The coffin breaker seemed crude, but it was actually stern. Hai Tang's finger sword seemed gentle, but it was actually fierce. The long dance on the imperial platform was also a kind of competition. But in the end it seemed that Fan Xian had still lost. Now that the fake fight was over, the clear light from the roof still shrouded the secluded hall. Fan Xian and Hai Tang stood in the clear light. Their faces looked incomparably gentle in the light. The half-moon lantern that had fallen from the roof of the hall was reflected in the pool. This competition could be said to be a true laughing contest. The bright river and the moon shamed the palace. Night gradually enveloped the depths of the palace. The half-moon slowly climbed up from behind the green mountain behind the palace, spilling its warm and faint light into the northern Qi Palace. The long black eaves and the gray and white palace walls reflected a beautiful figure at the beginning of the night. The ministers in front of the main hall were retreating out of the palace. Many guards could be seen around the palace, and there were also eunuchs waiting on the road. The speed at which the courtiers retreated was extremely fast. In a short while the imperial palace regained its tranquility. There were no longer any miscellaneous people on the empty square. It only took the time it took to burn a stick of incense to turn from bustling to extremely quiet. After the banquet ended, the Empress Dowager rubbed her temples and returned to her bedroom. Fan Xian was left behind by the Emperor of Northern Qi, waiting in Huaying Palace. The palace was incomparably quiet. The faint scent of incense wafted into his nose. Fan Xian sat with his eyes closed. The Emperor of Northern Qi should be in the Empress Dowager's palace, fulfilling his filial duties. He didn't know why he was waiting here. The palace maids brought him tea and fruit. Fan Xian smiled and thanked them one by one. He found that the palace maids were all very charming, especially the slight shyness in their eyes, which made his heart flutter. But when he thought of the young emperor leaving him in the palace, and how the emperor seemed to have some problems in certain areas, Fan Xian's heart trembled. His Majesty has something he needs your help with, Master Fan. The other girl, who was looking down, seemed to have guessed his fear and said calmly. The one who spoke was Haitang. Fan Xian was staying in the palace as a guest, so she had to be half a host. The girl thought of the scene in the hall earlier and felt a little dazed and amused. Why was it that when she was with Fan Xian she always seemed more presumptuous than usual? Fan Xian smiled and didn't explain. A eunuch shouted something from outside the palace. A series of hurried footsteps approached Huaying Palace. Fan Xian thought, why the rush? What does this young emperor want me to do for him? He is the emperor of the 9 and 5. Apart from unifying the world, there is nothing he can't do. While Fan Xian was full of questions, the young emperor had already stepped into Huaying Palace. With a wave of his hand, he stopped Fan Xian and Haitang from paying their respects. With his right hand, he took off his outer robe and threw it to a young eunuch who followed behind him. Only the thin yellow robe was left, and he looked very spirited. Then the emperor sat down on the couch. With a push of his feet, a eunuch carefully took off his boots, revealing his feet, which were only wrapped in thin socks. Perhaps Haitang was used to seeing the emperor in private, so she wasn't surprised. Fan Xian was a bit surprised that the Northern Qi emperor had revealed such a private side in front of him. He didn't hide his surprise. Turning his gaze toward the soft couch, he even, intentionally or unintentionally, tapped the emperor's chest and feet a few times. Not big, not small. Not big, not small. Chapter 251. Mother likes peace and quiet. The young emperor leaned back on the couch and took a sip of the swallow's nest that a eunuch had brought him. He frowned and waved his hand for all the palace maids and eunuchs to leave. The palace hall immediately quieted down. Fan Xian bowed slightly. What are your orders, Your Majesty? Seeing how cautious the southern envoy was, the emperor of Northern Qi smiled. Minister Fan, he said, you will be leaving for home the day after tomorrow. Make sure you take good care of the first princess. Fan Xian was startled. Only now did he realize that he had not been paying attention to this important matter. Welcoming the first princess back home to be married was an important matter. There could be no mistakes on the journey. These days, he had long learned from Yan Bingyun that this great princess of Northern Qi had been raised deep in the palace. She was the half-brother of the emperor in front of him. Her birth mother had long died in some cold palace. The great princess had never been liked by the Empress Dowager, which was why she was willing to let her become a sacrifice in a political marriage. He didn't know why the emperor had suddenly mentioned the first princess. Logically speaking, the emperor should not have had much of a relationship with that sister. But seeing the faint worry on the emperor's face, Fan Xian knew that he had guessed wrong. As expected, the emperor sighed. The first princess has never left the palace. Now that she is married off to the south, even though I am the son of heaven, I cannot protect her. Fan Xian said sincerely, do not worry, Your Majesty. The great prince is a hero of our kingdom, and is most respected by the people. The great princess and the great prince will certainly live in harmony in the future, and they will grow old together. All the officials in the court will treat the princess with respect, and will not dare to slight her. The emperor laughed coldly. What use is that? He suddenly stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Minister Fan, I see you as a friend. I hope that while you are in Nanjing, you will give the first princess some advice. You must ensure that she lives a happy life. Fan Xian was shocked again. He had only met the emperor 4 times. How could he dare be a friend of the Son of Heaven? Seeming to guess what he was thinking, the emperor smiled and said, Minister Fan, when we first met, I said that I liked your poems and often recited them. Those words were as if you were speaking. Since I have spoken to you for a year, it is not surprising that I regard you as my friend. At this moment, Fan Xian was truly overwhelmed by the favor and ashamed. Just as he was about to kowtow to thank the emperor and cry out in fear, he heard the Northern Qi emperor's light voice ring out. There was a glimmer of anger in the voice. But Minister Fan seems to be distancing himself from me. Not to mention the fact that he refuses to come into the palace to talk to me. The Northern Qi Emperor suddenly looked into his eyes. Even if there are many things you still hide from me. Fan Xian was worried. He explained, there are many matters to attend to. I am busy with both Honglu Temple and Taichang Temple. I dare not leave the palace and disturb your majesty's rest. The Northern Qi Emperor glanced at the silent Hai Tang and suddenly smiled. Is that so? I thought that these days, the most you have done is accompany my aunt disciple to go shopping and drink. Hearing this, even Hai Tang could not continue to sit still. With a trace of unease, she replied, Duo often asks Sir Fan for guidance on the way of the heavens, and has benefited greatly. His Majesty shook his head and looked at Fan Xian. Then how long do you intend to keep that matter hidden, Minister Fan? A drop of cold sweat emerged from Fan Xian's hair, but it refused to slide off his forehead or reveal the fear in his heart. It only remained in his long black hair. Fan Xian's first thought was, had Sea Lily's matter been exposed? If that was the case, then even if the emperor in front of him did not like women, the Son of Heaven's desire to monopolize power would not allow him to leave Northern Qi alive. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Hai Tang's calm face was calm, without a trace of fear or unease. He felt a little more at ease. He coughed twice and respectfully asked, What matter does your majesty speak of? No one knew about Shaoen's matter except for Hai Tang, who might have guessed a little. As long as it was not about Sea Lily, Fan Xian would not feel the slightest bit of guilt or fear when facing the Northern Qi Emperor. Unexpectedly, the Northern Qi Emperor's next question almost made Fan Xian fall off his chair. Tonight's conversation in the palace was one of shock after another. I have come to ask you, how is your sister Lin? The Northern Qi Emperor looked at Fan Xian coldly. It was like a bolt of lightning had struck deep into the palace, like a girl crying out in the middle of a thunderstorm. Fan Xian was dumbstruck, his body stiff. For a moment he did not know how to answer. How could this emperor know that Wan'er was his cousin? That was to say, he knew his true identity. That was impossible. That was impossible. There were no more than 5 people in the world who knew of his true identity, and those 5 people could not have leaked this shocking secret. But the problem was, the Northern Qi Emperor was the Son of Heaven, and had countless capable subordinates. Could it be that he had discovered this matter from some traces in yellow papers? Otherwise, why would he suddenly ask about his own wife, his sister Lin? The Northern Qi Emperor looked at him coldly. Seeing his panicked expression, he suddenly slapped the armrest of the soft couch and scolded, Speak! Speak my ass! Fan Xian's expression was mostly faked, but he still maintained a strong calm inside. His left pinky slightly crooked, but he suddenly remembered that because he was afraid that Hai Tang would find out about his connection to the incident at the cliff, he had not brought the black dagger on his left leg these days. Fight? He could not beat Hai Tang. Escape? If Northern Qi revealed his identity, wouldn't the Crown Prince, the Great Prince and the Second Prince immediately become a pack of hungry tigers? And those women deep in the palace? Fan Xian coughed and a smile reappeared on his face. Since the emperor had said it in front of him, naturally he was prepared to threaten him. So he prepared to play dumb and listen to the emperor's conditions first. Your Majesty, what are you talking about? The Northern Qi Emperor stood up. Stepping on the soft boots, he couldn't be bothered to put them back on. Just like this, he walked directly toward Fan Xian. The expression on his face gradually brightened. From the slight anger earlier, it turned into a faint smile. In that smile, there was a hidden sense of excitement and anticipation. Seeing this expression, Fan Xian was startled. He was even more certain that this little brother of the emperor was a little pervert. A pair of hands grasped Fan Xian's shoulders, and the Northern Qi Emperor somewhat lost his composure as he shook Fan Xian's shoulders. His eyebrows danced and he laughed brightly. Minister Fan, oh Minister Fan, you have kept me in the dark. You have kept everyone in the world in the dark. Fan Xian had long since given up on the idea of forcing the Northern Qi Emperor to flee to the ends of the world. He looked somewhat stupidly at the face that was so close to him, and found that the emperor was quite good-looking. The emperor bathed every day and his breath was quite fresh. Hai Tang looked at the emperor's fervent expression, and at Fan Xian's stupidity, and could not help but laugh. Grandmaster Chao. The Northern Qi Emperor shook him again, making Fan Xian dizzy. Grandmaster Chao. Quick, tell me, did Sister Lin end up with Baoyu? He finally understood what was going on. Although he did not know how the Northern Qi Emperor had guessed this, Fan Xian could no longer bear the torment of surprise and joy. He sat down on a chair and without saying anything else, he picked up the teacup beside him and took 2 gulps. The emperor looked at him with a smile. If you do not finish telling me the story of the stone, I will not allow you to leave the palace. Fan Xian sighed. How did your majesty know that the story of the stone was written by me? The emperor looked at Hai Tang and Hai Tang smiled. Books are only published by Dambo Bookstore. Mr. Chow has always been a recluse, and other than Dambo Bookstore no one else knows who he is. The story of the stone is very popular, and who knows how many people have tried to guess who he really is. The day before yesterday when we were drinking, Sir Fan seemed to have talked a little too much, and naturally I guessed a little. Today your majesty has tried to trick me again, and since Sir Fan has admitted it, I guess I guessed correctly. Fan Xian smiled bitterly, not knowing what to say. In truth, he did not really need the reputation of being the author of the story of the stone. Seeing how the Northern Qi Emperor had called him Grandmaster Chow so intimately, he had almost mistaken him for Guijia. Presumably he was also a fan of the story of the stone. Having confirmed that Fan Xian was the author of the story of the stone, the Northern Qi Emperor seemed very happy. Quickly tell me, he said, how many girls did Baoyu marry in the end? Fan Xian laughed in spite of himself, thinking that this emperor was a fan of harem novels. He waved his hands and pleaded. Your Majesty, I have only randomly written some 60 chapters. I have not thought of the rest. As he said this, he thought of Ruoruo and Danzhou when she had asked him to write. He had thought of the problems of writing, updating, and leaving it unfinished. It was a very troublesome matter. Hearing this, the Northern Qi Emperor sighed and frowned. He glanced at Hai Tang, who was resting to the side. Suddenly he moved closer to Fan Xian's ear and said in a low voice, the Hai Tang Poetry Society in Chapter 37. What does it have to do with Aunt Master? Out of the corner of his eye, Fan Xian saw that the corners of Hai Tang's eyes had softened slightly. He knew that she was eavesdropping, and so he smiled and replied boldly. Your Majesty, the author cannot explain himself. Forgive me for not saying more. The emperor revealed a hint of warmth and said, then return quickly, Minister Fan. Once you have a chapter, remember to send it to me. Fan Xian accepted the order fearfully, not daring to say more. Chapter 252. Walking on the bluestone path of the palace, the full moon in the sky and the two of them in the forest, Fan Xian's back was already soaked with sweat. Even in this summer night he still felt a little cold. He let out a breath of turbid air, still feeling a little scared. Patting his chest, he complained to Hai Tang beside him, you guessed that I wrote Story of the Stone. Why didn't you tell me? You almost scared me to death with that emperor of yours. Hai Tang laughed. Who told you to hide it from the world for so long? Then she rolled her eyes. Why are you so afraid? If it wasn't for your identity as Grandmaster Chow, then what were you afraid of His Majesty saying? Fan Xian didn't even think about it. He smiled gently. What do you think? The corners of Hai Tang's mouth curled up slightly. She said nothing. Fan Xian tilted his head to look at her. He saw that her long eyelashes were tinged with a layer of silver, giving her a kind of pure beauty. Her eyes, the most outstanding feature of her face, were especially bright in the night. The silver moonlight really did have a kind of magic. That kind of haziness seemed to be able to turn any ordinary woman into a worldly fairy. Fan Xian didn't feel anything. He just put his hands behind his back and slowly walked forward. You tricked me this time. I'm not seeking revenge. You should know why. You want me to help you with something. Hai Tang smiled. Although I don't know what it is, I think it has something to do with the South. That's why you need an outsider like me to help you. That's right. You and I are actually both hypocrites. Fan Xian's lips curled into a strange self-deprecating smile. So when we talk, it seems we can be a little more direct. What I need you to help me with may or may not happen. In any case, when the time comes, I will send someone to inform you. Hai Tang looked at him and suddenly said, I hear that you love the illegitimate daughter of the Prime Minister very much. That's why you haven't even taken in the head servant, that grandmother in Danzhou. I don't like you probing into my family matters. Fan Xian turned his head and said seriously, this topic ends here. Hai Tang smiled and nodded. Actually, I'm just curious. What kind of person would feel comfortable when they see women and uncomfortable when they see men? They would think that unmarried women are pearls and married women are fish eyeballs. They would think that women are made of water and men are made of mud. They would think that women are precious and men are lowly. After a long string of words, Hai Tang stared into Fan Xian's serene eyes and said softly, I am very curious. In this world, men are respected. Why does Master Fan have such views? Fan Xian smiled and did not reply. Hai Tang suddenly curtsied and said seriously, on behalf of all the women in the world, Duo thanks Master Fan for establishing a legacy for the boudoir and fighting for women's rights. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, I am different from most people in this world. After leaving the palace, Haitang was surprised to find that the Grand Tutor was still standing guard outside the palace. Fan Xian's expression did not change when he saw His Majesty's teacher. Presumably he had already known about it. Haitang bowed to the Grand Tutor and then turned to Fan Xian. I will see you off the day after tomorrow. Fan Xian understood the hidden meaning in her words. He nodded and got into the Grand Tutor's carriage. Watching the 3 carriages gradually disappear into the night of Shangjing, Haitang's bright eyes suddenly became unfocused. She thought about the last words of that handsome young official from the south. Different? In the eyes of the world, Fan Xian was naturally different. But she did not know how he thought he was different. The carriages stopped outside a quiet courtyard. The imperial soldiers responsible for the diplomatic mission's safety finally learned that the great scholar of southern Qi, Fan Xian, had made his last visit in northern Qi. He had come to see this master. Thinking of the poem duel that had been rumored all over the world, they could not help but feel uneasy. They did not know what Fan Xian was thinking, but in this courtyard filled with books, they naturally quieted down. The tiger guards in the first carriage got out. Their eyes were fierce and they guarded a few key points. Fan Xian and the Grand Tutor of Northern Qi walked down from the carriage hand in hand. Although their attitude was not necessarily friendly, it did not seem to be hostile either. Everyone felt a little more at ease. They saw the Grand Tutor, who had always been upright and outspoken, quietly say something to Fan Xian, and the 2 of them pushed open the door and entered. Fan Xian waved his hand, indicating that the tiger guards should not follow. Outside a room in the courtyard, the Grand Tutor bowed deeply to the inside of the room. He turned back to Fan Xian and said calmly, Master Fan, my teacher has not been well recently. Please do not talk for too long. Fan Xian politely bowed to the great scholar, tidied his clothes and gently pushed open the wooden door. Looking out, he saw an old man holding a small brush and scribbling something on a piece of paper. This old man was a master of scripture, and his students were spread all over the world. The Grand Tutor of Northern Qi and Shu the scholar of Southern Qi were both his disciples. Before Fan Xian revealed his brilliance, no one could compare to him in scholarly matters. Even after Fan Xian shamelessly defeated Guo Jingming in the palace hall in an attempt to win by a fluke, no one truly believed that other than poetry, Fan Xian had reached the level of Guo Jingming in other areas. This was because the old man's surname was Zhuang, and his name was Mohan. There were no servants in the room, nor was there a page boy. Only the old man, wearing a loose robe, continued to copy. Occasionally, he would frown and stare at the paper, flipping through the pages beside him, as if looking for some sort of confirmation. Compared to last year in the kingdom of Qing, Zhuang Mohan's spirit seemed to be much worse. Although his silver hair was still tightly bound, the age spots on his cheeks had become more pronounced, revealing some sort of inauspicious sign. Fan Xian did not want to disturb him, so he quietly walked behind him and cast his gaze on the table. He was surprised to find that on the table was the Bangxian's High Poetry Collection from Danbo Bookstore. And on the margins of the poetry collection, who knew how many notes had been written? Could it be that this master of literature was writing notes for the poetry collection he had memorized? Zhuang Mohan's withered finger pointed at the second half of the line in the collection. Those who have seen the ocean cannot be water. Those who have not seen Mount Wu are not clouds. He kept tapping the page, his lips slightly parted, and with some pain he said, "It doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. There is only the beauty of words. The second half of the line doesn't make sense, it really doesn't make sense. Tell me, what does it mean?" After a moment of silence, Fan Xian's gentle voice rang out, "Mount Wu is a sacred mountain in the extreme south. It is surrounded by clouds all year round, clouds at dawn and rain at dusk. Anyone who has seen this scenery and this cloud will not be bothered to look at any other white fog in the world." These two words are the second half of the line, purely speaking of emotional loyalty. So that's how it is. Zhuang Mohan smiled bitterly and pointed at a thick book in the corner of the large table. Of course I could guess what it meant, but I couldn't find it. Flipping through this book, I couldn't find the cloudy Mount Wu. So it is a sacred mountain in the extreme south. No wonder I didn't know about it. Fan Xian saw that Zhuang Mohan did not suspect that he was making things up, and knew that this old man was a very gentle and tolerant person. So he smiled and stepped forward to grind the ink. He watched as Zhuang Mohan copied his explanation into the blank spaces of the book in small, meticulous characters. Zhuang Mohan's regular script was famous throughout the world, and its purity was second to none. But looking at it today, Fan Xian could not help but sigh. The old man's hands were trembling a little. The Prince of Qin used to hold banquets and drink wine without restraint. What's the story behind this? Zhuang Mohan did not look at him and continued to ask. Fan Xian felt awkward. When he was publishing the poetry anthology, he had specifically deleted Li Bai's bringing in the wine. Why was this old man asking him? Zhuang Mohan sighed. Ever since I was a child, I have a photographic memory. I can't help but be proud of myself. That day you recited poetry like a river and I couldn't help but feel a little hurt. The old man laughed at himself. But it was thanks to this ability that I could remember so many of your poems. Later, when the Bangxian's High Poetry Anthology was published, I found that many of them were missing. I don't know what you were thinking, child. Hearing Zhuang Mohan call him child, Fan Xian felt a strange feeling in his heart. He coughed twice and explained, the Prince of Qin was a prince with the surname Chao. He once held a banquet in Pingguang. A prince with the surname Chao? Zhuang Mohan raised his head. His cloudy eyes carried a trace of self-confidence. But, for 1,000 years there has never been a royal family with the surname Chao. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and tried to persuade him. I'm just spouting nonsense. You don't have to worry about it. That won't do. Zhuang Mohan was stubborn in certain areas. He flipped through all the poems he had written by hand and pointed to one of them. In the middle is Little Xie Yu Kingfa. Who is this Little Xie? Fan Xian's face alternated between green and white. After a while he replied, Little Xie was a scholar who wrote stories. Although his writings were crude and could not be passed down, he had some fame in the marketplace. Then, after some time, when Fan Xian felt that he had run out of things to say and had lost interest in life, Zhuang Mohan finally sighed. He rubbed the corner of his eyes and threw his brush into the inkstone. He said with some sadness, I've run out of oil. I can't compare to when I was a scholar. After entering the room, the two of them did not greet each other. They threw themselves into this somewhat absurd task until now. Fan Xian rolled up his sleeves and bowed politely. Greetings, Master Zhuang. I don't know why you've summoned me here. The room became quiet. After a long time, Zhuang Mohan suddenly trembled, and with great difficulty he bowed deeply to Fan Xian. Fan Xian was so shocked that he forgot to help him up. What kind of person was this old man? He was the Grand Master of the Emperor of Northern Qi. Why would he come to pay his respects? Zhuang Mohan had already straightened up. His wrinkled face was full of smiles. It's been a year since we met last year in the kingdom of Qin. I've always been virtuous. Last year I framed Master Fan in the kingdom of Qin, and I've felt uneasy ever since. I've asked you to come here today to make amends. Fan Xian was silent. Of course, he knew that Zhuang Mohan had accepted the eldest princess's request. He had given up decades of face and traveled thousands of miles to the south to be a villain. It was all for the sake of Shaoan's release. This was brotherly love, what Fan Xian lacked the most. Shaoan is dead. Fan Xian looked at the old man in front of him, who had suddenly become much thinner in the past year. His thin lips parted slightly and these four words came out. Zhuang Mohan looked at him with a smile but said nothing. Fan Xian also smiled, knowing that he was being unnecessary. After all, Zhuang Mohan was an old Taoist who had been in the world for decades. He had deep roots in the kingdom of Northern Qi. How could he not know of this major event? Everyone has to die. Zhuang Mohan's words seemed to be for himself to hear, but also seemed to be for Fan Xian to hear. So if you live, you must live well. The way my brother has lived is meaningless. He killed countless people and in the end he ended up like this. Fan Xian didn't quite agree with this saying. In this world, murder and arson are golden belts. Repairing bridges and paving roads leaves no corpses. Zhuang Mohan shook his head. Don't be that kind of person. It wasn't that he couldn't, but that he didn't want to. If any outsider were to stand in this room and hear the conversation between Zhuang Mohan and Fan Xian, and see their natural and unpretentious expressions, they would feel a little strange. The difference in life experience between these two people was too great, and the only time they had met was because of a conspiracy. Yet these two people could use the most direct words to express their attitudes. Perhaps this was the so-called power of books. Why not? There was a chill between Fan Xian's brows. I'm very confident. Zhuang Mohan suddenly laughed, but there was a deep sadness hidden in his smile. I'm confident that I'm much happier than my brother. Fan Xian stared into his eyes. But you should know that if it weren't for Shaoen, perhaps you would never have obtained the position you have today. Zhuang Mohan stared back at him. But you still don't know. When death gradually approaches, you will realize that power, status, and wealth are all just fleeting clouds. Fan Xian replied calmly and stubbornly, no, when death comes perhaps you will regret this life. You haven't experienced anything, you haven't enjoyed anything. You only already have something in this life that normal people will never be able to have. That is why when Hualao passed away you had some thoughts. Zhuang Mohan shook his head helplessly. You are still young. You have never smelled the deepening smell of death around you day after day. How would you know what you will think when the time comes? I know, Fan Xian repeated somewhat mechanically. Believe me, I know that feeling. Zhuang Mohan seemed to be a little tired, and he didn't want to continue this topic. He changed the subject. I didn't think that the person who could write such a rebellious text as Story of the Stone would still be my own filthy work. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. I also didn't think that such a thing as a rumor could fly faster than a bird. Zhuang Mohan's eyes suddenly revealed a trace of concern. Master Fan, when you return home you must be careful. Story of the Stone has many taboos. Fan Xian was silent. He also knew this, but in his youth he had been frivolous. He couldn't bear to lose the opportunity for those words to appear in this world, so he had casually written them. Now that he was in officialdom, he naturally understood that if someone wanted to find innuendo in them, it would be all too easy. Furthermore, there was a coincidence in this matter that shocked even Fan Xian, so he had no choice but to be cautious. It was a pity that the Emperor of Northern Qi was also a fan of romance, so this matter couldn't be hidden any longer. But Zhuang Mohan shouldn't be so concerned about him. This was what Fan Xian was puzzled about. Zhuang Mohan seemed to guess what he was thinking. He smiled. Master Fan, I invited you here today not only to apologize for my selfishness, but also to thank you. Thank you? Fan Xian frowned. He didn't think that Zhuang Mohan knew that he had extended Shaoen's life by a day. I thank you on behalf of all the scholars in the world. Zhuang Mohan looked at him with a smile. Master Fan, when you first entered the Overwatch Council, you exposed the fraud of the Kingdom of Qing's imperial examinations. This matter affected the world, and even His Majesty wanted to reform the imperial examinations. Master's actions will benefit many poor scholars. Perhaps you do not think much of me, but on behalf of all the scholars of the world, I must thank you. Fan Xian's lips curled up in a self-deprecating smile. Exposing fraud? That's the business of scholars. Is there a need for thanks? But Zhuang Mohan did not smile. His turbid eyes were a little lifeless. He had not done much to bring Shaoen back to the country this time. The most important thing was that he did not want this matter to cause the entire court to descend into chaos. But he knew that this world was not made up entirely of scholars. There were politicians, schemers, and martial artists. Their methods of handling matters were sometimes more direct and wilder. He looked at Fan Xian. He was about to say something, but then he remembered that this was, after all, Northern Qi's internal affairs. There was no need to say anything to him. After a long time, Fan Xian left the courtyard where Zhuang Mohan lived. He never returned for the rest of his life. Summer arrived. Although the hottest days of the year should have long since passed, Northern Qi was located in the northeast of the continent. Autumn was particularly hot and humid, and the drizzling rain that was common in late spring and early summer had long since disappeared. Only the bright, white sun hung overhead, frivolously and fiercely forcing people to take off their clothes until they couldn't. Outside the southern gate of Shangjing, a bright yellow carriage disappeared through the gate, and the old, greenish-gray city wall immediately became the most conspicuous thing in the eyes of the people outside the city. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes as he looked in that direction. He felt uneasy. The emperor had personally come to see off the Qing diplomatic mission. This was completely against the rules. No matter how the Northern Qi officials tried to dissuade him, they couldn't stop him. So they had no choice but to send a large number of high-ranking officials and powerful officials. Even the Grand Tutor had come out of the city to see them off, giving the Qing diplomatic mission enough face. Earlier, the emperor and Fan Xian had been holding hands and chatting about everyday things, constantly thinking about the story of the stone and the like. Who knew how many gazes they had attracted? With great difficulty, they had finally managed to get this somewhat eccentric emperor to leave. Outside the city were only the officials of Northern Qi and the ceremonial guards. Fan Xian glanced around and saw Wei Hua, but he did not see Chang Ningho or Shin Zhong. He felt his back was drenched. He didn't know if it was because of the emperor's fright or the sun. The auspicious hour had not yet arrived, so the diplomatic mission could not leave. He looked at the most magnificent carriage in front of the group. The great princess of northern Qi was in it. He had only glanced at her from a distance. He could vaguely see that she was a beautiful noble, but he didn't know what her personality was like. But Fan Xian wasn't worried about the return trip. After the incident with Haitang, Fan Xian was more confident in his ability to get along with women. A cool breeze swept past and Fan Xian immediately relaxed. He tugged at the buttons on his clothes, thinking, how could there be such a gentle breeze in this terrible weather? He turned his head and as expected, Wang Qinian was next to him, waving his fan in a fawning manner. His face was full of sadness and reluctance. Fan Xian couldn't help but burst out laughing. It's only been a year. Why are you so sad? I'll take care of your wife and children. Don't worry. With the diplomatic mission leaving, Yan Bingyun naturally had to follow them back home. As a result, the Overwatch Council of Qing's spy network in northern Qi was suddenly without a leader. So the Overwatch Council decided to have Wang Qinian stay in Shangjing as the minister of the Grand Herald Temple of Qing's permanent residence in northern Qi. He would temporarily take charge of matters in the north, and in half a year, the council would secretly send officials to take over. As commissioner, Fan Xian's status in the council was special. Matters like this did not need to go through the formalities of the yamen in the capital, so it was easily settled. But Wang Qinian hadn't expected that he would not be returning with the diplomatic mission. He couldn't help but feel uneasy and disappointed. Although he knew that this experience would greatly benefit his future promotion, he still felt a little uneasy. Sir, if I don't listen to you for a day, I feel uneasy all over. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian reluctantly. Fan Xian smiled. Don't get into conflict with northern Qi. Be wise and play it safe. In a year's time I'll welcome you in the capital. In truth, he was used to having such a sidekick at his side. Most importantly, Wang Qinian was his only trusted aide in the council. Unfortunately, because he had to prepare to deal with the eldest princess's money channel, he had no choice but to stay in northern Qi. While they were talking, a horse suddenly came out of the city gate. The person on the horse was not an official, but was dressed like a servant. He couldn't help but attract the attention of the officials. They thought to themselves, why would the yamen of the 9 cities of Shangjing let a commoner come here? Fan Xian's eyes were sharp, and he saw that the face of the Grand Tutor, who stood at the head of the group, darkened and his eyes showed sorrow. The horse rode directly to the front of the group, and the servant on the horse fell off. With a sobbing voice, he moved closer to the Grand Tutor and said something. He handed the Grand Tutor a roll of cloth, and then pointed to the city gate behind them. The Grand Tutor's body swayed. He didn't know what had happened, but he looked at the carriage slowly approaching from the city gate and shook his head sorrowfully. He turned his head to glance at Fan Xian, but his eyes were filled with surprise. He took a deep breath and then walked toward Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't know what had happened. He nervously dismounted and went to greet him. He accepted the roll of cloth the Grand Tutor handed him and nervously opened it. He saw that it was a collection of poems. On the pages were a few words written in slightly meandering old handwriting. Bang Xian's High Poetry Collection, Notes by Lao Zhuang. The Grand Tutor looked at the silent Fan Xian with mixed feelings and said, "This was given to you by Sir." Speaking to this point, his tone couldn't help but carry a deep sorrow and heaviness. Sir Zhuang has gone. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.